All right, I'd like, ooh, I don't like that echo. I'd like to call the village board. This is going to be a problem all night.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody muted? I don't like to hear myself once, much less twice. So there you go. You got it? Okay, thank you. All right, I'd like to call the Village of Cottage Grove a special meeting of the Village Board of Trustees, the Library Board, and the Budget Review Committee. So because we are holding this as a Zoom meeting as well as in person in the Village Hall. The Zoom link is at the top of the agenda, or for those who choose to call in, and the audio, there's an audio call-in number as well. We will call each committee or board to order individually. So we'll start with, since it lists the trustees first, we'll start with the village board. So roll call, I guess. Confirm.
Ballwig. Aye. Murphy. Present. Peterson.
Aye.
Here. Stoa.
Here.
Valencia. Present. And Williams.
Present. And Cindy for the library board? Or David? What do you? Just, we'll do
Allie. Here. Stephanie. I'm present. Tracy.
Here.
Eric. Stephen.
Here.
David.
Here.
Thank you, Cindy. And then for the budget review committee, we have everybody here that is here. So we've got
Jim Elmore's missing.
Jim Elmore's missing, but we have a quorum. So Melissa, myself, Cindy, and that's it. Sarah.
No,
I'm sorry.
Heidi. Yeah. Heidi.
It's been a year, so. Hey, the gang's all here. All right, so we called the three bodies to in order. What I'd like to do is start off actually this particular meeting with some news over the weekend, to take a moment of silence for one of our local firefighters, Cottage Grove firefighters, Nate Walker, and his family. Nate passed away yesterday, so if we could just take a moment for Nate and his family. Again, Nate, thank you for your service. All right, we have a quorum for all three entities. We have the agenda properly posted, and we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next up, we have public appearances. This is the public's opportunity to speak. So if there is someone from the public, we just ask that you share your name, your address, your municipality, and hold your comments to no more than 3 minutes. So we'll open that up to either on the Zoom or in the room. All right. Moving on, then we have a presentation to the board and the committees. And this is a presentation from Ellers. So, Jonathan, right, please.
Good evening. I'll start with introductions. My name is Greg Johnson, a senior municipal advisor with Ellers, and this is my colleague, Jonathan Schatz. We both have worked with the village for several years, including working on this annual financial management plan update. Just a little bit of history. The village developed its first financial management plan several years ago and has been going through this annual update each year as part of a kickoff of the budget process. And really the objectives of this plan are to kind of review the status of the village's current financial position, some of your strengths, some areas for improvements. But really the emphasis of the financial management plan is to really provide a long-term financial forecast that looks at all aspects of the village's budget. We define that as the village's annual operating costs in terms of what's needed to provide services on a day-to-day basis. We also look at the village's multi-year capital improvement plan, identify various financial strategies to accomplish capital and reinvestment in infrastructure, and really try to look at how that impacts the overall tax levy and tax rate in a multi-year context. And really the objective is to kind of set a framework for going through your annual budget process. This doesn't replace your annual budget process. It enhances it. It helps kind of set that framework as you typically go forward and adopt a budget around November of each year. So our role in this process as the village's municipal advisors to really kind of provide some general financial guidance and overview, kind of alert you to trends that we're seeing in terms of where some financial pressure points may exist, whether it be on the operational side, and look at the impact of funding certain levels of capital investment. We'll talk about several scenarios this evening that look at various levels of capital investment within the village. What our role is not is to really make certain decisions on behalf of the village. In terms of what the village decides to do from a capital improvement standpoint is at the discretion of the village board and the various groups that are here this evening. We're privileged to work with several hundred communities throughout Wisconsin in this capacity. And our job is to help you find financial ways to accomplish your objectives. We're not going to weigh in and tell you which street we think you should pave or which water line you should replace. That's not our role. Our role is to help give you good financial information to understand the impact of providing existing services, maintaining investment in capital, and what the impact is of adding any additional services. So that's just kind of some context and kind of the background in terms of what we're going to talk about this evening. So both Jonathan and I will be interjecting, and we'll certainly be happy to take questions and comments as we go through the information. So we want to start by just kind of summarizing some of the background information on the village's current financial position. The village has a bond rating with Standard & Poor's. They've had that rating for several years. The village's rating is AA. So the highest rating you can obtain is AAA, then it's AA+, and then AA. So the village has had a very strong credit rating in terms of when it goes out and borrows money for capital infrastructure investments. So the rating helps lower your overall borrowing costs. Certainly the higher your rating, the more attractive the bonds are that the village sells for capital investment, which can help reduce the interest expense that is paid anytime you borrow money for capital projects. So S&P provides a nice third-party assessment of the village's financial strengths in areas where they may see some pressure points. What the S&P has historically commented on is that the village has very strong reserves, very strong fund balance, and very strong liquidity. What that means is that gives the village some financial flexibility year to year to react to certain financial circumstances or unforeseen events, that may materialize. So certainly when you look at, what could trigger that, we're on the heels of what many communities were dealing with was the pandemic, and where those reserves and having that financial flexibility was helpful to kind of navigate that unforeseen situation. The village also has very strong financial policies and very strong management in terms of monitoring your budget and having strong budgetary performance each year. S&P has noted in their reports this process that the village goes through every year in terms of doing a multi-year update, and we share the update each year with S&P so they see that the village is really looking at things in a multi-year context. Areas where they've identified that they're going to continue to monitor, one is, debt, the amount of debt that's outstanding. They recognize that the village has been growing. With that comes the need to, invest in infrastructure. And, while they, note that they understand that some of that debt issuance and increases are expected to kind of keep up with that growth, they want to make sure that, remains manageable from a financial standpoint. And certainly when we show them each year, each time the village goes into the bond market, that we're planning several years ahead for capital debt issuance, that kind of helps reinforce that management philosophy and governance philosophy of the village board, that those decisions are being looked at in a multi-year context. So generally speaking, the S&P credit profile is very favorable to the village, has been for several years, and is generally a nice positive assessment of the village's financial condition. So I mentioned one of the village's main financial strengths is fund balance, and we've included on page 4 kind of a definition of the fund balance, categories. And really the main area that S&P and that we focus on is kind of your assigned and unassigned fund balance, because that unassigned fund balance really represents that liquidity and financial flexibility, that the village has to kind of address unforeseen circumstances. And certainly, the higher you're rated by any of the rating agencies, the more they're going to kind of look at that fund balance. And while there's a whole host of economic and financial factors that the rating agencies consider when they assign their rating, the one that they probably put as much emphasis on, because the village has direct control over it, is the village's fund balance, because that's an amount that the village board can really dictate through its actions. And so they place a lot of emphasis on that unassigned fund balance. In terms of appropriate uses of fund balance, we've kind of listed several here. The main one is to kind of provide, again, some financial flexibility to address capital needs or just general cash flow needs throughout the year, cover anything unanticipated in terms of, revenue loss or some increased expenses, emergencies, and so on and so forth. And the village has really stuck to a lot of these fundamental uses of fund balance. They've used them at various times over the years to handle some additional capital expense, to pay down some debt. But the village has, the past several years really maintained strong fund balance levels. So really, when we look at a planning context, what we don't want to make sure that we're relying on is fund balance to fund day-to-day operational services, under the theory that eventually that money is going to run out, and if you're expected to continue to fund those services and those costs, you're not going to have a sustainable revenue source to pay for it. So the village has been very good historically about using fund balance appropriately, but still maintaining very strong fund balance levels. And that's described here in the chart that kind of shows, going back to 2016, kind of where the village's unassigned and assigned fund balance has been for the general fund as a % of total expenditures. So that's really kind of ranged in the mid to upper 30% of total expenditures, which is strong and which is healthy. And as I said, has really been a key factor in terms of the village maintaining that AA rating. So your fund balance levels have been strong. It gives the village some financial flexibility to use that for covering some capital items, as the village has done particularly the last few years, but still maintain very strong fund balance. And so that's I think one of the village's main financial strengths, that we want to make sure that we continue throughout this planning process. I want to touch briefly on the village's TIF districts and just kind of provide a general high level in terms of the TIF districts that are outstanding, and then we're going to discuss how that really impacts the village's finances over the next several years. So I'm going to give a brief introduction in terms of what a TIF district is and how it works. So a TIF district is an economic development or redevelopment tool that has a defined geographic area. And you'll see there's a map on the slide that kind of shows the location of existing TIF districts. And when a TIF district is established, all the properties within that TIF district have an existing taxable value. The village and all the other taxing jurisdictions, the county school district, technical college, all continue to collect their share of tax revenue on that existing value at the time the district was created, just like they do presently. So there's no loss of tax revenue to the village or any other TIF district or any other taxing jurisdiction when a TIF district is created. Where the TIF district provides financial benefit to the village is when there is new development activity or redevelopment activity within that TIF district that increases the value over when the district was initially created. So that increase in value over time, that's called the incremental value. And the village retains all of the tax revenue on that incremental value. The village's share, the county share, school district, and technical college's share, and uses that tax revenue to pay for expenses that are directly related to making development happen within the boundaries of those TIF districts. So a TIF district fundamentally is kind of two things. One, it's a partnership between the village and all the other taxing jurisdictions, because they're agreeing to forego their share of tax revenue on that increase in value to help pay for expenses to bring that value to fruition, under the theory that without the investment of that TIF district, that value may not be generated, may not happen as quickly, or there may be some job creation, other factors, that are helping bring that development to fruition. Second, what the TIF district does is that it financially really ties a geographic area to helping pay for expenses, directly related to that geographic area. So if you have a TIF district that is underserved by infrastructure, whether that be streets or utilities, and you need to expend dollars to extend, infrastructure to that area, you can use TIF revenue to pay for those expenses directly. So it's a way of using tax revenue from a particular development to pay for expenses associated with that development. So that's really kind of the financial benefit to a TIF district if that development materializes. So the village has several active TIF districts, TIDs 5 through 10. TID 5 is Commerce Park, adjacent to I-94. That district is projected to close in 2026, so we're going to talk about the impact of that in a moment. TID 6 was across the street from Village Hall, but was what's called overlaid by TID District number 9. When TID 6 was initially created, there was not a lot of development that occurred, while that district was open. And so to kind of provide a longer period of time for that development to materialize, a new district was created over the existing district, which is TID 9. TID 7 is projected to close next year, so that's happening here in the near term. And then TID 8, 9, and 10 are a little more recent. TID 8 is on the West Cottage Grove Road corridor. There's been some multifamily development within that TID district, but there's been no major TID expense incurred as a result of that development, but the value is estimated to be about $11 million. In TID 9, there's about $30 million under construction, but the village hasn't incurred any major expenses in that district yet as well. And then TID 10, north of I-94, where the proposed Amazon development's expected to occur, which conservatively is estimated to generate about $200 million of incremental value. So we'll talk about really, the impact of TID closures in this analysis, because that's, we're really looking out for operations and capital really at a 5-year planning window. And since you have some TID closures that are occurring within that 5 years, we'll be talking about what the impact of that's going to be, which is generally positive. So next we're going to kind of speak to the village's valuation and really talk about the valuation. There's kind of two types of values that we typically look at. One is called the TID out value and one is called the TID in value. So the TID in value is basically the value of all property within the village, including any value in your existing TIF districts. And that really only comes into play with that full value when we talk about the village's general obligation borrowing capacity. So that's when the current incremental value helps the village in that context. But when we're going to be talking about future tax rate projections, we're really going to be focusing on the TID out value, because when I said when a TIF district is created, all that new value that's generated pays for expenses within that district. That value is not available to pay for other general expenses outside the district until that district closes. So that's why when we're looking at the general tax rate to pay the village's operational expenses, your existing debt and capital, the village's levy each year, we'll be talking about TID out values. So this chart kind of on page 8 shows kind of the history of the village's TID out value for the past 5 years. And this is on an equalized basis. So there's equalized values and then there's assessed values. Equalized values are essentially market values, and they are certified each year annually by the Department of Revenue. So the Department of Revenue publishes kind of a breakdown each year of how a community's equalized value changes. And they break that down by how much of that change is due to economic change, just general appreciation or depreciation within the village, the amount of value change that's due to new construction, as the name implies, new construction activity, new value generated within the village, and then everything else kind of falls into kind of the other category, which can be corrections from the prior year in values and personal property. So we've kind of summarized the growth in the TID out equalized values over the past several years and kind of show what that average change has been related to economic change, new construction, and then other and personal property. So that kind of gives you some context. You can see the TID out equalized values have increased anywhere from 3.6% to 6.19% annually over the past 5 years. So when we look at the history, we like to do a projection of that value. And so on page 9, we show kind of the valuation projections on an equalized basis and kind of our projection methodology. And so we like to be conservative in these models. That's been our approach from when the model was initially developed, and every year when we update it, we don't like to overestimate in terms of what we think is going to happen with the village's overall value. So we've kind of taken your average 5-year history, we've discounted that by about 50%. To kind of build in that conservative factor. And so on page 9, we kind of show how that projection methodology works on an equalized basis. But here is where we start to see how the closure of TID districts can benefit the village's valuations going forward. So when a TID district closes, all of that value that was generated goes back onto the tax rolls, and that benefits all the taxing jurisdictions, village, county, school district, technical college. So on page 9, you'll see that for the 2023 valuation year or next, the 2024 budget, TID 7 will close next year. The current value in that district is about $33.4 million. So you'll have an additional $33.4 million of value coming onto the tax rolls, which will impact your 2024 budget. So when we look at the 5-year projections for the tax levy and the tax rate, that tax rate's going to take those TID closures into account by seeing that increase in value. And then a larger TID district is TID District 5. That's projected by the time it closes to have a little over $160 million of value. That's projected to close in 2026, which impacts the next year's budget in 2027. So you'll see in this chart on page 9 that there's a significant increase in value in that projected TID out equalized value column, particularly from budget year 2026 to 2027. It's a projected 20% increase in value. That's because you're getting $160 million of incremental value from TID 5 coming onto the tax rolls in a given year. So that's really the financial benefit of a TIF district is really at the time of closure. So it's really kind of a long-term economic development strategy that the village uses to generate value, and then when that district closes, you see the benefit of that value returning to the tax roll. So we're going to see the potential impact of that when we look at the projections over the next 5 years. On page 10, we've taken those equalized values and we've converted it to assessed values. So I think when most taxpayers look at their tax bill, they're looking at their assessed value in terms of the actual value that the assessor assigns, which is kind of how the tax bill is calculated for a particular homeowner. And so, when market values or equalized values are determined by the Department of Revenue, we convert those to assessed values based off of the village's current assessment ratio. So the current estimated assessment ratio for the village is a little over 92%. So that means for a typical home, that has a value, the assessed value that's being taxed is about 92% of the market value of that community. And so when communities start to see that assessment ratio drop, you would go through a revaluation process to kind of revalue all properties within the village to kind of make sure that the tax bill remains equitably distributed between all of your taxpayers. That's why you go through a revaluation process to make sure that the proportional share of that tax bill still gets split fairly amongst all the different types of property value within the village. So we've estimated that assessed value going forward, kind of estimated when there may be some revaluations to kind of get back to kind of full value. But all the tax rate projections that we use in this model will be based on assessed value. So that's just some background on equalized value and assessed value. We'll talk about which one we're referring to on certain charts. Most of the time we're going to be referring to assessed value and TID out value because that's really what the village has available to pay for your annual budget as it's adopted. So before I kind of transition into the operational model. That was kind of some background information. Any initial questions? Too fast, too slow? Keep
Doing just fine, Greg.
All right. Well, next, let's start getting into kind of the detail of the model. So we're going to talk about kind of the expenditure forecasting methodology that we have used within this model. And just to kind of give some background, so we look at the village's budget and all of the line item detail within the budget for every department. So this forecasting model is done on a line item basis for every specific line item in every department's budget. But when we're doing this multi-year forecast, we kind of like to keep an eye on the big picture, where things are going. When the discussion on particular line items is really better suited for your typical budget process. But there's a lot of detail behind these numbers, but we're presenting things in kind of summary form because we want to stay focused on the big picture. So we look at all of the various line items in the budget. We assign kind of what we call a classification code. We've broken down expenditures into general categories. Commodities, your general supplies within each budget, your employee insurance benefits that you offer, your other types of insurance coverage, property and liability, workers' comp, other forms of insurance that the village maintains. You have your general services line items, contractual items, things that you pay for within your budget, and then you have your wages in terms of what you're paying, for personnel, which of course is typically the largest line item in any municipal budget. And so what we've done is we've kind of forecasted out, those costs based on a classification code. So each line item in the budget is assigned one of these classifications, kind of inflates those numbers, and if we adjust the assumptions, it automatically kind of updates that whole line item forecast. So you're all familiar with what's been going on in the broader economy in terms of inflation, and inflation being at 40-year highs. And certainly that's putting pressure on budgets as communities are looking ahead to the next fiscal year in 2023. In terms of whether or not these very high inflationary factors are going to remain in place over the next 5 years, difficult to say. I think our thinking is, yes, it's putting some pressure on things in the near term. Are we really going to see prices at that level over the next 5? Probably not, and hopefully not. If we are, that's just going to quite honestly change the dynamic for everybody rather significantly, particularly in a levy limit environment, which we're going to talk about. So we've kind of still remained conservative. I mean, there's going to be maybe some higher pressure points in the short term, but I think we didn't want to assume that what we're seeing in the economy now, 40-year highs, is going to be the norm for the next 5 years. But that's where the benefit to updating this annually comes into play, because obviously we'll see how the next 12 months unfold, and making these adjustments in this model annually allows you to kind of react to changing circumstances. But with that as background, on page 12 is kind of a high-level summary of the village's general fund. So again, this is all driven by line item detail through the entire village's budget, but we've broken down revenues and expenses, kind of at a high-level summary. So the primary revenue source for the general fund is property tax levy. Wisconsin is a property tax-driven funding mechanism for local government, which is different from other Midwestern states. Other Midwestern states have a much more diverse revenue streams available to fund local government services that simply are not available to Wisconsin municipalities. Common example is sales tax revenue. A lot of other communities in upper Midwest have local sales tax options, that can help fund day-to-day operations. That's not available to Wisconsin municipalities. So really, property tax revenue, the village of Cottage Grove is no different than really any other municipality in the state. That's really your primary revenue stream. Your other main revenue source is some intergovernmental revenues, state shared revenue, transportation revenues that come from the state, And then you have kind of your litany of other revenues, licenses and permits, charges for services, park and recreation programs, kind of the whole gamut. And really what we see in the village's revenue profile is pretty similar to what we see in most communities. Property tax, primarily revenue source, intergovernmental aid, and a lot of those non-levy revenue sources don't fluctuate much from year to year, or communities aren't comfortable budgeting significant fluctuations in that revenue each year. You'll see some modest change, but I mean, really, when you're looking at your revenue availability going forward, it's really driven by property taxes. On the expenditure side, we have the main categories that are typically broken down in your financial statements in terms of general government, public safety, public works, health and human services, culture and recreation, and conservation and development. And so we show kind of those expenditures and kind of how they are trending. So on the bottom of this chart on page 12 is we show how that general fund levy is projected to change from the prior year. So we show how it's changed the past several fiscal years and how it's projected to change going forward. So it ranges from about 4 to 5.5%, per year. So that really identifies, in a conservative model, what we're anticipating your levy is going to need to go up just to pay for operations. We're going to talk about levy limits, and we'll kind of come back to some of these numbers in this chart when we talk about the parameters that the village has for levying property taxes, because it certainly impacts your general fund, your operating budget, but it impacts some of your other funds as well, which we're going to look at when we look at the village's total levy. But that gives you kind of an idea of how kind of operational costs are trending, in our model that we forecasted going forward. So a little higher than where you've been, but that's kind of based off of, where we've seen costs trending, higher here going forward. Another component of the village's property tax levy, albeit a small one, is the street tree fund. So there are expenses that the village pays for just kind of its street tree program. The levy for that, in this year's budget was about $69,000 per year. To just kind of cover costs, over the next couple of years, that levy may increase by 2027 to about $83,000. So really just showing that you'll, need to continue to levy those funds to pay for that program and the expenses that are associated with it. So it's a component of your levy, but a very small one. So the next component of your levy, and there are four, there's the general fund, the street tree, and now we'll talk about the third, which is the capital levy. And village staff has spent a good amount of time here over the past couple of months kind of retooling kind of the village's capital levy and capital program. The village has had a very good financial practice of trying to levy tax dollars to pay for routine capital items and avoid borrowing for those, which, from our perspective, from a financial standpoint, makes perfect sense. Okay, no argument from us. That's a great financial approach. The challenge with that is that capital levy is subject to levy limits, which we're going to talk about. But you have a cap on how much the village can increase its levy each year. Your operational budget subject to that cap. The street tree levy is subject to it, and so is your capital levy. So while it would be a good financial practice to levy a tax and build up funds or pay cash for capital items on an annual basis, your ability to do that is somewhat limited due to levy limits. But we've kind of broken down the capital into three categories, and this is kind of new in terms of how it's being presented this year. So we have the general levied items that you'll continue to levy a tax for and either pay for directly with cash in a given year, or you may build up some cash over a couple of years and pay for those items. And those are all, listed in the presentation. Then we have kind of the next category, which is shorter term debt, which is kind of items that are going to be debt financed, but are really going to be financed over a 5-year term. So trying to keep that repayment and interest expense down. And then we have the long-term debt, which is really your larger core infrastructure projects, some larger fire equipment apparatus, and your various facility projects, which you would amortize over a longer term. The term that we show in this model is up to 20 years. So that's kind of the three buckets of capital that have been put together in the presentation. So on page 15 is just kind of the breakdown of the capital items that are subject to the levy that you're going to continue to fund. And then you'll see off to the right kind of how those costs are changing annually over the next couple of years in terms of that property tax levy. So that is what we have incorporated, into the budget in terms of the capital levy. So that, but there's the detailed list of all of those items. So staff did a very good job of kind of delineating, what will continue to be funded through a levy and apply those funds annually to kind of keep borrowing down going forward. Then on the next several pages is kind of the detailed breakdown of kind of that medium category, the middle category of shorter term debt. So everything that's kind of color coded shows what would be funded and financed over a 5-year term. So some of these items are related to shared costs between the levy and the utilities, and so we've allocated those costs appropriately, between those repayment sources. Anything related to the, general village is paid for through the property tax levy. Anything that's either entirely or partially assigned to the water sewer utility would be repaid through utility rates. So it kind of shows the breakdown of all those particular types of projects. So those would be repaid with debt, but amortized over a 5-year period. So then the next page kind of shows the breakdown of all of the long-term infrastructure and capital projects that would be financed with longer-term debt, mainly up to, all of this cumulatively gets financed over a 20-year period. And then, again, this consists of, kind of your larger road improvement projects, some of your larger park improvement projects, and then includes your various facility improvements. That includes the village campus, various phases, and then the library project, and then the emergency services station. So what's shown in this first chart is all of those project costs kind of in their entirety. We've ran 3 different scenarios that look at the library. In this initial chart, that construction cost is estimated at $12.5 million. So in terms of the various capital scenarios we're looking at, this chart shows kind of the, the maximum dollar amount that we've kind of modeled in this plan for capital investment, which over the next 10 years totals $77 million. That's a big number. We're going to see that puts, some meaningful impacts on the village's tax levy going forward, just due to the gross amount of that dollar amount. Don't take that as a statement that, we're making judgments on the needs or that there isn't, some significant capital investment needed in the village. We recognize that there is, and we see that everywhere, and so you're not alone in that regard, but, that's not an insignificant sum. So we're going to see, as that dollar amount changes and fluctuates, what that does to the overall financial condition of the village and the future tax levy, but that's not an insignificant amount. So again, that kind of encompasses at a high level, roads, facilities, park, and some larger fire equipment acquisition. So we've initially we were asked to kind of run 3 different scenarios, and then we've ran a 4th scenario that we'll talk about as well. But really the primary difference in these scenarios really relates to the library, the proposed library in terms of operating costs and the estimated construction costs. So I've kind of summarized the general fund, the street tree levy, the 3 components of capital. There's no difference in those in any of these initial 3 scenarios we're going to look at. The difference is in the library operational and the related architectural and engineering and construction costs for the library. So scenario 1 has a construction cost of about $12.5 million, architectural and engineering at $720,000, and then operating costs, starting at $780,000 and increasing 4% per year. Scenario 2 in the middle, $7.1 million construction, $430,000 of A&E, and then $550,000 starting for an operational cost. And then scenario 3, $4.4 million in construction, $365,000 operation, and $290,000 architectural and engineering. So we're going to kind of see how that impacts the levy, the operational costs will impact the, operational part of the levy. We will show that, in the model. And then the architectural and engineering and construction costs are financed with debt. So that's going to impact the debt service levy going forward. So really the main difference in these initial three scenarios we're looking at is the operational and the capital costs for the library. And these were numbers that were provided to us to model. So before we talk about the impact of new debt, let's talk about where you're at presently. So let's talk about your existing debt service. So the village currently has principal and interest payments that it makes on existing general obligation debt. General obligation debt is the most common type of debt that's issued by communities. It's legally backed by an irrepealable tax levy, meaning the village can levy whatever is necessary to repay that debt service. The village uses property tax as its primary source to repay that debt service, but some of the other projects were attributable to the water and sewer utility or attributable to specific TIF districts, and revenue from those utilities and those TIF districts helps offset, or what we call abate, your debt service payments. So you don't, while your total gross principal and interest payments, are at a fixed amount, how you repay those comes from multiple revenue sources. But the primary revenue source is the property tax levy. So in this existing debt summary chart on the far left-hand side shows your total GO debt service payments, some other expenses that are typically budgeted in your debt service fund, and then we show how much revenue is needed from the water utility, sewer utility, TID 5, TID 7, and some other revenue sources to repay that debt service going forward. So in that net tax levy column, that shows how much the village's levy for existing debt service would change each year just based on the debt that's outstanding. So you'll see the debt service levies, projected to go up, even before we look at the impact of financing all these additional capital projects. So going forward, we'll be talking about how that debt service levy is going to change, with all these various capital investment, but this kind of shows where we're starting from. So let's get into the details of scenario one, and we're going to start with the debt model for that scenario. So again, in this scenario, we're looking at kind of the full funding of all the capital projects at the higher level. So this included the $12.5 million for the library on the capital side. So here we're seeing, if you kind of look at the far right-hand column of that chart under levy and tax rate, total net debt service levy, we're showing that the levy just for debt service from 2024 through 2028 is going to go up about $940,000 a year. That's kind of the impact in the near term of the next 5 years of kind of all of that investment in infrastructure that we were highlighting. So that's just the levy increase just for debt. That doesn't factor the increases needed for existing services or any new services that you're adding. So from 2029 to 2032, that drops off a little bit down to about $500,000 a year. But you're looking at some higher capital costs here in the near term over the next 5 years, and so that's what's driving that increase in the debt service levy. And then that gets a little more spread out, that increase over the next couple of years. So that's kind of shows at the higher level, at the higher range of the capital investment of these scenarios, you're looking at a debt service levy increasing almost $1 million a year. So that's a meaningful impact when we look at the impact to the total budget, which we'll look at next in a couple of slides. In terms of the village's borrowing capacity, this is the one area where we talk about TID-in value. So for the village's borrowing limit, this is based off of general obligation debt. So the amount of general obligation debt that the village can have outstanding, just principal outstanding, is capped under state law. It cannot exceed 5% of the village's total equalized value, including value in TID districts. So at the end of 2022, the village is going to have about $23.2 million of general obligation debt outstanding. Your statutory limit is 50.3 million, so the village is at about 46% of its debt limit. You'd have about 27 million of borrowing capacity remaining. Based on this model, what would be funded over the next 10 years, we're projecting that the village would get up to 97% of its debt limit, which very bluntly we do not recommend at all that you do. That's too high. While you can legally do it, you can reasonably expect that the village would get downgraded based on that level of debt, which would drive up the village's borrowing costs and leave you, very limited, financial flexibility to handle anything that's unforeseen. I'll kind of, do a spoiler alert as we look at, future slides, what we, kind of the maximum amount that we would recommend that you, get up to, or, the maximum we would consider that you get up to. We're not recommending that you do it, but is about 75% of your limit. Even that's kind of pushing the upper ranges, but if you're presenting that in a multi-year context to the rating agencies, if you're getting there kind of gradually and they can see it's thought out, I think we're confident that that's, not that they're not going to, a rating agency wouldn't express concerns about that level of debt, they would, but I think if they can see that it's done in a planned context and you're not going from 46% to 75% overnight, I think it's all in how it's presented and, looking at it in that multi-year context. But, if you're at 97% of your debt limit, to be candid, don't care what you're funding, whether it's streets, facilities, other infrastructure, parks, doesn't matter. If you're getting to 97%, that's just not advisable. So, just based on that borrowing limit, this borrowing under scenario one, all of it in its totality is just at levels that are too high. Yes?
At what percent of limits do you jump into the high threshold?
Really above that 75%. So, even 75%, I think and that depends certainly on the size of the community. That's not a blanket number that applies to every community in the state. That's kind of the number for a community the size of Cottage Grove. I think, as I said, I think if you can show that, that's funding some core infrastructure and it's done in a planned, multi-year context, will the rating agencies have concern about that level of debt? Yes. But I think it can be explained in terms of why you're at that level. You get above that threshold, even if, there's political support, you're going to, levy the taxes to pay for it, it's just going to be viewed as not a financially appropriate level of debt.
And then is there a specific number of years that
Hey, Cindy, can you turn your microphone on?
if you were to jump up to 75% plus, is there a specific amount of time? Is it 1 year or is it, you have a buffer zone?
I think it kind of depends. I think ideally if you were showing that it was kind of for a period of time that maybe you were going to be at an elevated level and it would start to kind of curtail back down, I think that's preferable. I think if you're going to be at that level and sustained at that level, that's a little different of a conversation, particularly from the rating agency perspective. But then the bigger question really comes down to just affordability in terms of whether or not there's political support to levy taxes to support that level of investment, regardless of what you're funding.
And then the consequence to that is your rating goes down, so then your interest rate goes up.
Correct.
And can you give us an example of how much your interest rate goes up?
Yeah,
What the
it's
impact
gonna
would be?
vary based on market conditions. I think, the village is at AA, so that you could go down to AA minus, the spread between AA and AA minus isn't as great, but if you start getting down into that A category, you could potentially see that spread, at times that could be as much as 25 to 35 basis points. 1 basis point is 0.01%. So if you're borrowing millions of dollars over 20 years, that adds up. So, it depends, on market conditions at the time, but, it all adds up over time for a particular financing in a given year, that may not look like that big of a number, but if you're planning on borrowing annually over a 5-year period, that adds up.
And it doesn't just affect the new borrowing, it affects the old borrowing as well?
It doesn't, from the village's perspective, it doesn't really impact your prior borrowings. They will change the rating of your prior debt, but that doesn't change the interest rate that the village is paying. It impacts how those bonds are traded in the secondary market, which doesn't, when the village sells the bonds, you're locked in at the interest rate. So if your rating changes on future bond issues, it's not like they go back and you pay a higher interest rate on your prior debt. It impacts how those debt is, investors who bought that debt will be impacted, but it doesn't impact the village directly, but impacts your prospective debt going forward. Next, let's talk about kind of levy limits, because this is applicable to all the scenarios, and so we want to kind of give some introduction here. So levy limits have been in place since 2005, and while there's been some variations in levy limits over that time, fundamentally, the basic core of levy limits really hasn't changed all that drastically. So under levy limits, you can increase your levy from the prior year by the percentage increase due to net new construction. And then you can increase your levy for certain permitted adjustments above the net new construction amount. So that net new construction percentage gets calculated annually, and changes each year. You do get the benefit of construction activity within a TIF district for your net new construction annually. So while a TIF district is open, you don't get the benefit of that value until the district closes, but if you get construction activity in a TID district while it's open, that does favorably impact your net new construction percentages for levy limits. So each year that percentage gets calculated. It's determined by the Department of Revenue in August of each year, and that's how much you can increase your base levy. And then you can increase your levy above that, based off of a litany of adjustments, the majority of which aren't, broadly applicable to Wisconsin communities. But the main adjustment that is applicable is debt service. Any general obligation debt that you issued is exempted from levy limits. So the village can increase its levy by whatever is necessary to repay debt service. So when I mentioned, kind of the capital levy in particular, that is, the village's 4 levy components: general fund, street tree, capital, debt service. 3 out of the 4 are subject to a specific levy limit cap. The one exception to that is debt service. And so what you've seen over 17 years of levy limits is more communities finance more capital projects with debt because it's exempted from levy limits, not because they want to, not because they think it's a good idea, not that we necessarily think it's a good idea, but there's just not a lot of choice under the levy limits. And so we're going to talk a lot about levy limits and kind of what the village can do going forward in the context of all of these things that we're modeling. But that net new construction percentage is kind of your limit. At various times when levy limits were first introduced back in 2005, there was kind of a minimum amount you could increase your levy by. The highest that was at any point in time was 3.86%. Don't ask me how they came up with that number. That's just the number they came up with. So if your net new construction was 1%, you could increase it by up to 3.86% because that was kind of the maximum threshold that they had set. Then it got reduced down to 2%, and I've lost track of time. For the past several years, it's been at 0. So 0 or net new construction. So your net new construction is your limit. What we've been seeing over, particularly I'd say the last year, and I think I'll speak for myself, Jonathan can whack me on the side of the head if he disagrees, that there's going to be more communities doing levy limit referendums. I think with the increase on pressure and costs and just the cumulative impact of 17 years of levy limits, I think communities are starting to see some of those financial pressures. And so I think you're going to see more municipal levy limits kind of going forward because communities can't, continue to maintain services under that net new construction threshold. So the next slide, the multi-year budget forecast, just kind of summarizes what I just said. Your various aspects of the levy, we're all accounting for it in this model, And then the capital improvement plan, we factored in as well. So let's talk about scenario one. So again, scenario one, funds, kind of existing services, anticipating increase in costs in those existing services, kind of funds a capital levy at amounts that staff had kind of estimated, kind of slightly decreasing, funds the debt service levy, which was based on kind of all of the higher level of capital investment, and then starts funding the operational costs for the library in 2026. So you'll see the history of kind of the total levy going forward, and then the box kind of in yellow shows how that total tax levy is going to change going forward. And then we show, how much per $100,000 of value, would be paid for just the village's portion of that budget annually. And then we show what the estimated tax rate per thousand would be based on the village's estimated assessed value, TID out assessed value. So let's kind of talk about those last three numbers on this chart. So we've got your assessed value and kind of projecting that going forward. So where the value really, kind of has a meaningful impact is in budget year 2027. That's when you're projected to see the impact of the closure of TID number 5. So while your total levy in this model is projected to go from 8.9 million to 10.1 million, your tax rate per thousand, if you actually levied that, would go down because you're seeing, several, over 100 million of value coming back onto the tax rolls. So that's illustrates the financial benefit of a TID district closure and all that value coming on. Your levy gets, numerator applied against the denominator is bigger. So that lowers the tax rate even though the levy is going up. That's the good news in terms of a TID closure. The problem that we're seeing within this model going forward is when it comes to levy limits. And we're projecting in all these models by 2026, the village is going to start seeing a levy limit gap. And when we've calculated the village's allowable levy going forward, we're calculating, you're at, or in these cases, in 26 and 27, exceeding what your maximum allowable levy would be. In the other years, we're taking it up as high as you need it to fund these things if you actually wanted to levy at these amounts. But we're basically showing, that kind of based on existing services, adding a service, seeing some significant capital investment for facilities and infrastructure, there's going to be a financial gap, that we're projecting could be as high as $2.3 million. So that just kind of shows, in the 5-year planning horizon, there's financial challenges here. This is going to be a refrain that you're going to hear as we go through these other scenarios, is that we're forecasting out some financial challenges. So they're not here impacting you yet, but they're coming. So I think, one of the main things that the village will kind of need to start tackling with is kind of being proactive to start trying to look at how that can be addressed, incrementally as you move forward, going forward to try to address that. And, 5 years out, a lot's going to change. The one thing I say in these models is I guarantee you the numbers will change. If I knew where everything was going to be in 5 years, I'd be sitting on a beach and probably not here. But this kind of shows kind of how that levy's, going to increase going forward, and that there's a levy limit gap. So, there's financial challenges here. But when we, again, kind of talk about.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I see the library in here, but the campus and the other, I thought that third box of long-term investment type items like the library, the campus, and the rescue station, why aren't those in here?
They are. They're in the debt service levy.
Debt service.
So that so in the top half, when you're looking at the fourth line down, it says debt service levy. So
But I thought that number was like $25 million. I'm having a hard time coming up with $25 million over that time.
This is the annual principal and interest that you're paying. So when
Okay.
you're financing that, that this scenario, showed over 10 years, 77 million of capital investment, you're amortizing that capital investment over 20 years.
So this scenario is capturing all three things we're trying to do.
That is correct.
Thank you.
That's correct. So I've mentioned, the levy components. The majority of this is subject to levy limits. The general obligation debt service is not. So next, let's kind of, talk about, the library. We're going to talk next about the library and the village campus kind of separately. So in this chart, the library impact of scenario 1, it just kind of forecasts, what are the impacts going to be for financing the architectural and engineering costs, the construction costs of $12.5 million, and the operational costs going forward. Just shows what the levy would be annually, what the tax rate would be, and the amount of taxes per $100,000 of value. So when you see in kind of the total levy required column, you're going to see there's some kind of fluctuations in those earlier years where it's a little higher, then it starts to drop, and then it kind of goes back up. The reason that is because of how the debt is structured for the library project. When we look at when we structure all of the debt for all the long-term capital projects, streets, parks, Village Hall campus, library, larger fire apparatus, all that debt gets repaid by the property tax levy. So while we're breaking down certain aspects of that project, it's all part of the debt service levy. So we're structuring all of those debt payments as kind of one big financial component of the budget. So when we start pulling out parts of this larger model, the debt service payments kind of look like they're fluctuating a little bit. That's because it's really part of a larger model. A couple slides back when I said, initially in this scenario, that debt service levy was increasing the next couple of years of about $940,000 per year. We're structuring all of this debt to arrive at a very consistent amount. But when we pull out a particular project, that debt amount looks a little different per year, but that's because it's part of a larger calculation.
Quick question. Make sure it's on. Looking at this table, if we were to do a capital campaign, how does that impact the expenditures? Would that be like a one-time P&I payment? Is that a principal-only payment? How does that typically work?
I think practically it would happen two ways, kind of depending on how it happened. So from a debt, I guess there's debt, and then so let me answer the debt question first. So if you borrowed, depending on when that money was received, so if you issued the debt in this model, in 2025, once you issue the debt, a 20-year bond issue is going to have a call date in about 7 or 8 years. So if you have some of that cash in the capital campaign at the time you're issuing the debt to pay for the construction, you could reduce the amount that you're borrowing. If you get the capital after you sell the bonds, you're not really able to make extra payments on a bond issue per se. You could use it to apply towards the debt service payments and levy less for the debt service payments. So kind of depending on when you get the cash is how you'd apply those funds towards the construction.
So in other words, the taxpayers themselves, let's work on that second scenario, right? So the bond is issued, the capital campaign completes. Would we just levy less? I mean, so from a taxpayer's perspective, they pay less in their taxes.
Correct. You would apply towards your debt service levy to reduce the levy. Okay. The key to managing that though is to try to, not cause your levy to start kind of fluctuating wildly. I mean, if you get an influx of, making up a number, $500,000, maybe you want to apply that $500,000 over a couple of years, as opposed to saying 1 year. We'll apply that $500,000 for the debt payments. Next year, that $500,000 is gone. The levy spikes back up again. So that's kind of the key. You may just want to manage how you apply it, just so it doesn't, cause your budget to kind of spike unintentionally.
Is that more be for the budget purpose, or for the taxpayer, like having large fluctuations in their tax levy?
Both.
Or both?
Yeah,
Okay.
both.
Okay. Thank you.
So the next slide, we look at the village campus. Same analysis, kind of primarily here. It's showing, debt costs, being financed in 26, 27, and then, 29 and 31, kind of the various phases of that project. What that total levy would be, tax rate per thousand, and, the impact on $100,000 of value. Same caveat applies here. The debt structure was taking into account all of the debt being issued. When we extract that out, the debt numbers kind of fluctuate a little bit. So that's why there may be some fluctuations from year to year. but that kind of shows, what the impact is, for that particular project. Since, those are, certainly part of the, both these projects are a larger part of the village's, capital investment. So scenario one, just again, some kind of high-level conclusions here.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. For the campus impact, how come there aren't operating costs in that one?
I think the operational costs, we were provided kind of the estimated construction costs. I think the operational costs, I don't think have really been fleshed out as of yet, but yeah, that would need to be part of the analysis.
$100,000 of value would go up significantly for village campus impact scenario one?
It would change from what's here. I mean, you'd have likely changes in costs for the facility, depending on what you do with this facility. You may have some, some of your existing costs may just get applied to the existing, but yeah, you'd have to factor it in.
Greg, I can say that this is Matt Giese. The operating costs are already factored into our existing operations and would only increase within levy constraints.
So that includes the 46
year.
new staff?
Sorry,
That
what?
was in the study,
Yeah.
in the FGM study.
Cindy's asking if it includes the 46 staff proposed in the FGM architect study.
No, it includes our existing staff at 37 full-time, and we would increase annually as the board approves it in a budget.
Most of the space is for vehicles and other things, so, and obviously,
But the library operational costs include library staff, correct?
correct.
Okay, thank you. So they're kind of different apples and oranges?
Well, the library is 11, or in scenario one, 11 new FTEs right as that opens. This is incremental each year, 1 to 2 additional staff members within our levy limits, which is what we've been typically doing as a village. So we're out of space currently for the staff we currently have. The big part of this is for vehicles, police cars, those types of things where we're kind of running into issues. This space is not big enough for a village of 9,000 currently, so that's another piece of this too. So it's not a lot of necessarily people right away, it's people over time, and it's the space needs for the village itself per the study that was done.
Thanks, John. For instance, this year we added 4 full-time staff.
So just to kind of summarize scenario one, the village is at 97% of its debt limit, which we already discussed is really not levels that we recommend that the village reach. The average levy increase for all components of the village's levy, general fund, street tree, capital, debt service, that total levy increase is 17% per year on average increase annually over the next 5 years. What the village has averaged the past couple of years is 6%. And then we're seeing that levy limit gap by 2026. So the next scenario is scenario 2. Again, the main distinction here is the library construction costs at $7 million, architecture and engineers at $430,000, and then the operating's at $550,000. So for the debt service levy, here from 2024 to 2028 for all of the capital projects, identified in the capital improvement plan, that debt service levy is projected to increase by about $865,000 to $870,000 a year. In the prior scenario for 2024 to 2028, excuse me. So in the prior scenario, that was closer to over $900,000 a year. So, as the costs come down, obviously the principal and interest payments go down, so that levy impact is less, but still, a significant, part of the increase in the total levy per year is going to be attributable to debt service. Then again, we show it kind of starts to drop off after 2029, but still seeing levy increase by about $500,000 per year. In this scenario, the borrowing capacity gets up to 90%. So again, still well above levels that we would recommend the village, consider getting to. I don't recommend you get that high at all. And so, again, really, this just isn't feasible from a borrowing capacity standpoint, just based on these borrowing amounts. And then in the multi-year levy projection for scenario 2, we kind of see, that projected levy increase going forward, and still seeing kind of significant levy limit gaps, in 2026 and 2027. So again, it's the debt service levy, and debt service levy is what's changing in all these scenarios, because as you look at different borrowing amounts, that's really what's changing in these models. The levy for the general fund, the street tree, the capital, is the same in all of these initial 3 scenarios. So it just kind of shows that total increase.
Greg, can I ask a question? So the reason why the 2027, let's just look at the bottom right corner of that slide. The reason that $2 million gap in levy limit, the levy limit gap is so close to scenario 1 is because the actual principal and interest payments aren't included. It doesn't affect your levy limit gap. So really the change in scenario 2 is a less expensive library with less operating expense, but the only thing that comes off of this bottom right corner number is the operating expense, the difference in the operating expense.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, generally what's driving these numbers is, the debt service, that debt service levy adjustment is changing based on the debt service model changing from the prior scenarios and just kind of the other aspects of the budget. But yes, that's primarily what's driving this.
And
It's
Greg,
largely operational.
Quick question too. On this slide in scenario 1, do you call out the library operation specifically for us to see, or is that a 5th category for some reason? I just want to understand.
It was put on there just so we
could
as
see
much
it.
for our benefit as hopefully
Okay.
yours, just to call it out. So
Okay.
we modeled, we have a detailed general fund levy, which kind of funds existing services. We didn't partially for our modeling purposes.
Sure.
We just didn't want to add other things in there, so we could kind of make a distinction between existing services and a new service.
Okay.
If you're adding a new service other than the library, we would do the same
Sure.
thing. So we're not doing that because it's a library, we're doing it because it's a new service.
And it would, though, go under the general fund levy is where
Yes,
those dollars would
ultimately,
go.
that's how it would get incorporated
Yeah.
into your budget. But since at this time for how we're discussing it, it's a new service, we wanted to isolate it from the rest of our model. And again, if you were, building a new pool or whatever and adding a pool, we do the same thing. So,
I just had one other question. So the debt service levy, is it only certain types of debt that are not subject to levy limits, or did I misunderstand?
I'm sorry.
I thought I heard earlier that debt service is not subject to the levy limits.
Yeah, I
That's
think,
different type of debt.
I'll answer your question, but I think I'll also answer, what you're referring back to. So in terms of, from a levy limit perspective, debt service is exempt from levy limits, meaning it doesn't count. But in terms of there's also the limit on the amount of general obligation debt you can have outstanding. That's that borrowing capacity that we're looking at on the prior chart. So that general obligation debt is the only type of debt that has a limit in terms of the amount that you can issue. So the other form of debt is called revenue debt, where you're pledging some other revenue source to repay the debt service. The most common type of revenue debt that the village also has outstanding is revenue debt that's pledged to be repaid by the water or sewer utility. There's no legal limit on the amount of that debt that you can have outstanding. You can issue as much as you want as long as you're willing to repay it. Did I answer your question?
Yes, but I do have another follow-up then. So looking at the scenario 2 debt service levy, so when we're looking out in 2027, 4.3 million, that would include also water and sewer and all of the debt payments that would fall under levy limits? Or are they so the levy limit that we're looking at includes all of those 5 things, even though is the debt service levy, it contributes to that levy limit?
That is correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Yeah, so your levy limit, all aspects of your levy are part of the levy limit calculation. So we look at your total levy, but you get an exception for the debt service levy. The rest of it is really falls under that net new construction limitation.
Okay, thanks.
So
Question. For the percent of limit then, how we see that in scenario 2, it goes up to 87% in 2031. Does it continue to go, 90% and then drops down to 87? Does it continue to go down after that?
yeah, it continues to kind of gradually go down. I mean, we've modeled out future debt issuance, out over, a multi-year period. So, but admittedly, I think the longer we go out in these models, you're going to see the more likely things will change. So it does start to go back down. But I mean, the main takeaway here is it's reaching a level we never recommend that you get to, regardless of what you're funding. I mean, this is really, as far as the debt capacity, we're just talking about total amount of debt being issued. We're, not necessarily what you're funding. It's just debt it's just too much debt.
Greg, if I go back to page 19, and I look at, and I understand, we send you data, you plug it into the calculator, and it spits out this table. I guess I want to ask a general question, right? When I look at 25, 27, and 29, those are some pretty big years for borrowing. Mm-hmm. In terms of the village campus projects, like, to me, these are just, they're line items. I don't know what's in these line items. So I guess I'm asking bigger questions here as to, like, what are in these line items? Because I don't know. And so I'm just wondering if, and I know we have another scenario to go through, but I guess I'm asking a general question of staff, right? Like, and maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse because we haven't talked through all the scenarios, but I'm just trying to think, is there a way to space this out? Is there a way to,
I can speak to it a little bit.
Go ahead, Matt.
So, the facility study that FGM did recommended that these phases happen in 24, 26, and 30. So we pushed the initial 2 phases, 3 years, and the phase 3 by 1 year. And the detail that's in each phase is in that study, but from a high level, the first phase would relocate Village Hall into the Municipal Services Building. It would expand and renovate public spaces, add additional, or add a new village board meeting room, and it would renovate and expand Parks and Rec space. Phase 2 would demolish the old Public Works building and create a yard. Drawing a blank at how best to explain, but like a storage yard over there for materials and things like that. It would expand the Public Works garage and Public Works offices, and then phase 3 is for the police. And the police was the last to be needed, since that was the Municipal Services Building was initially designed with the PD in mind.
Thanks, man. I guess I'm just, when I look at, so from slide 19, I scroll down to, there's a lot of slides here. Slide 34, I'm just wondering, because it's that percent of limit, right, under proposed debt, that I'm just, Cindy, you kind of asked that question around, like, we're hovering around 90, 75% and above. I'm just wondering if there's a way to space things out so that we don't get above 75% as advised.
Yeah, I think that's essentially what would need to happen. There need to be more deliberate phasing we're going to look at another scenario that kind of strips out some of these capital projects and see how that impacts your borrowing capacity. So that kind of will, probably provides a more practical starting point to kind of start phasing in some of these other projects.
And I can interject too. I mean, we recognize this is this is an initial these are scenarios and you're workshopping these numbers to see how they play out. We were working to recognize being that the library was the board's #1 priority, we worked to shift the Village Campus project beyond the library project. So in the 5-year portion of this plan, there's only $16 of tax impact for that Village Campus project. Having said that, we completely recognize that for sure phases 2 and 3, although there's a need for those departments from a borrowing capacity, it's probably just not feasible even in the 10-year window. So, at best we'd be looking, and even then, probably working with FGM on seeing what we could do differently even in that phase 1.
Well, the other concern is we haven't even approved the campus yet either. Like, the board hasn't determined that that's the direction that we want to go with it. So, I think that's something that we need to visit as well, just to make sure that that is where we want to go with it. I know the study was completed, but we haven't really had the opportunity to talk about it.
Melissa, I'm sorry, I don't know if you get her mic on.
Well, yours is on, sorry.
Mine was on.
Can you turn yours on?
Well, were there other scenarios presented in the FGM study?
So Matt, did you hear what I said?
Yes.
Is that better?
I heard bits and pieces of it. Yeah, there were 3 different scenarios in the FGM study.
Yeah, so what I was getting at was basically, I don't think the board has made a determination as to which direction we want to go with the Village Campus. We were presented it, but I don't think we actually made a determination either, so that's something that we need to figure out.
Yep, that's very true, and I think that's what this is all about too. We need more direction.
Well, and David, so that's 77 million on the screen right now, but 15% of that is library associated.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm with Melissa here that, again, I don't want to telegraph too much, but I think there needs to be some sort of working group to go through all this, because there's a lot on this page. And I think this is the first time I've seen this page like all put together and all these projects in one place. So when you look at it, it's like, in the years that it's slotted, is it all appropriate? And again, maybe I think it's working in conjunction with staff to figure out when to put these on the calendar, right, on the timeline. Because it's just a lot. And again, it's all based on FGM study, right? So they said these particular years, but that's what's impacting the debt limit.
The library is too.
What's that?
The library is.
Yeah,
too, right?
absolutely.
And
I
they
think the library is part of this page, right? So it's all part of the same ball of wax. It's just I even asked Melissa, I was like, when you guys did it, because Brittany and I couldn't make that tour, did they talk about on the tour about the phases and what they're all? And Melissa said no. So
we had conversations about when they presented the 3 scenarios, and the board did kind of, I don't know if they formally did, but definitely selected this scenario because it was the most economical, and it got everybody together so we could leverage the economics of having staff on the same campus, which is what the architects actually recommended. So we did do all that. We did have these in the plans last year. They blew it up just as it stands today. We took them out, both library as well as the campus scenario. We've moved the campus scenario out, as Matt said, 3 years from what was recommended. We are growing faster than what the architects had in their analysis, so we're going to need more facilities for existing services. So yes, we do have to have a candid conversation about what comes first, what comes second. And in all these scenarios, because we're going to get to 4, none of them work in the next 5 years. Because again, our state legislators have put those caps in place, both on debt and levy. So all these things will have to move out beyond 5 years at least, is what I think we're going to have to come up with. And then we're going to have to work something, because we still have a problem even with them all out in 2027 on the levy side. So we're going to have to be creative there. So we're going to have to watch out the next 5 years what we spend our money on, and then plan from then on for these bigger projects.
So I think those are helpful comments. I think a lot of what you just talked about, we're going to kind of be talking about here as far as kind of next steps. But just to kind of start getting through these scenarios. So, on page 38, kind of the scenario 2 conclusions, we included breakdowns for the library and the village campus project as standalones in this scenario as well. But again, I mean, you're at 90% of your limit, which isn't recommended. Your average levy increase over the 5-year planning period averages a 15% levy increase per year, and we're still seeing levy limit gaps. So the scenario 3, again, that was kind of at the lowest cost in terms of the library project, in terms of what we're looking at for construction and in terms of operations and things of that nature. So we look at all of the debt service levy here, and you're still looking at some notable increases in the debt service levy, about $835,000 a year over the next 5 years per year, even at the reduced funding levels. In terms of the borrowing capacity of scenario 3, went from 90 roughly in scenario 2, now we're down to about 86%. So I mean, we're seeing some incremental improvement, but I mean, we're still at just borrowing levels we would not recommend that the village be at for regardless of what you're funding. That would just be too high of a debt burden. And so, for scenario 3 and the multi-year impact, that's on slide 42, just kind of shows how that total levy change would increase. Again, really the only changes in this model, again, was the debt service levy is, reflecting the lower costs of the library. The operational costs for the library reduced in this amount as well. But you'll see you're still seeing some healthy increases in the overall total levy under that scenario as well. And then we included some standalone analysis for the library and the village campus for this scenario also. So for scenario 3, again, you're at 86% of your limit, 15% average annual increase in debt service levy over the next 5 years, and you're over your allowable levy. So that kind of gets to an alternate scenario that we prepared. And the changes to that are summarized on page 47. The general fund operational levy and model is the same. The short-term capital, the levy for capital is the same. The short-term debt capital is the same. The long-term debt is kind of what has changed. And so to look at those changes, the county highway and urbanization from Oak to School on the west side, which is about a $3.1 billion project, was deferred from 2026 to 2029. All phases of the village campus project were eliminated, so it's $29 million of capital costs. The Homburg 6th Edition park improvements, totaling almost $2.8 million, was delayed from 2026 to 2029. And then the library operational A&E construction costs all eliminated in this scenario as well. So really kind of looks at the impact of operations and kind of the balance of your capital projects exclusive of any facility. So that, in terms of those capital changes, that's kind of summarized in the chart on page 48. So here we're still looking at capital investment of about $34.7 million. So not again, that's not insignificant either, but obviously a big drop from our highest amount where it was, that number was $77 million. So in terms of the debt service levy,
Greg,
that's projected.
Really quick, I'm on slide 48. I still see Homburg in here.
We moved it out a couple years.
I forgot how to read, sorry. Thank you.
So scenario 4, we kind of show how the debt service levy changes, still some healthier increases over the next 2 years because of, some higher borrowings in those years. Then the borrowing starts to kind of gradually level off and then kind of increase on the tail end of the 10-year model. So those debt service levy increases in 2026 going forward are under $400,000 per year. Not to minimize that, but I mean, it's certainly less than what we've seen in the other scenarios. So in terms of the borrowing capacity, on page 50, so this shows that the borrowing capacity, tops out at 54%. So you're at 46% now. So, that's not a huge, differential from where you're at presently, would likely not have any meaningful rating impacts and, but again, kind of omits any major, facility construction regardless of what that facility is. That's not factored in this analysis. So this really kind of looks at, core infrastructure that's in the CIP, parks, streets, and some larger fire apparatus in a general sense. So at least from a borrowing capacity, there's no real concerns at that particular level. But when we look at the multi-year scenario, we're still showing a levy limit gap in 2026 and by 2027. So, really what this shows is that just based on existing services, you're projected within this 5-year model to, be experiencing a levy limit gap. So if you add any service, regardless of what that service is going to be, it's going to put additional pressure on you from a levy limit perspective, because we're seeing pressure with just existing services and existing investment in the CIP. We're still projecting a levy limit gap. So, that's kind of a big takeaway from this presentation is, we're seeing some fiscal pressures, on the, longer end term of this kind of 5-year planning horizon. So the good news is that it's, you're not facing that gap for 2023, but levy limit decisions are cumulative. Decisions you make each year kind of impact what you're levying and what services you're providing going forward. So, I mean, it's certainly something to be mindful of kind of going forward. But, it shows that just under the current construct of levy limits, there's some fiscal pressures. And, this is not a situation I would say is unique to Cottage Grove. We're seeing communities that have had, financial levy limit capacity. We're seeing that, pressured, particularly, starting maybe this year and in years going forward. So, I mean, this isn't something that we're, I think when we built this scenario, we weren't, surprised at that outcome. I mean, it's kind of what we're seeing. So, so then it comes how you, start kind of, addressing kind of those, particular situations. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So in terms of this.
I'm sorry, can I ask a couple of quick questions? The levy limit numbers that you have in all of the scenarios, is that based on current new construction? Like, I know the levy limit is based on new construction, right?
Yeah.
And so the projections over the next 5 years, how did you factor in the construction numbers?
I mean, we were conservative in our projections. I mean, in terms of, so how that net new construction percentage is calculated, you take the amount of value that's generated in a particular year due to net new construction activity. You divide it by the total equalized value in the village, and you arrive at a percentage. And so, there's a lot of construction activity going on in the village. So we kind of looked at your 5-year trend and kind of used the higher range of that, knowing that you're seeing some meaningful development. So that, that number is going to fluctuate each year. I mean, we've been conservative. So, I mean, I think this levy limit gap is probably on the higher end. But I think since we update this annually, we can kind of react to this and as we get more information each year.
And can you share, how does the Amazon part fit into that? Does that not count as new construction because it's in a TID?
It does count. So,
Okay.
so that, as that gets phased in or built in, that's going to positively impact these numbers. I mean, we've, I think the timing of that, we'll kind of see how that kind of unfolds. I mean, I think we'll we'll have a little more visibility in that, but that's going to help quite a bit.
Okay, and so that's not factored in, the
Not to,
Amazon
probably not to the extent that it's going to impact your numbers. I
Okay.
mean, we're marginally increasing your net new construction. One-time large impacts from Amazon, I think we'll kind of take in real time.
Okay.
So I think that's going to make these numbers look better. So we've been very conservative. But is it going to close that gap? No.
Okay.
It's going to help, but it's not going to
Yeah.
eliminate it.
Okay, and then just two more questions, sorry, I've got them
No.
all listed here.
Go ahead.
In the models where we, and this might be for Matt too, where we are doing the campus, the village campus, my recollection is the study did not really say what to do with this land, or it said to sell, or there was something here, the revenue from whatever if we were to sell this property is not included in here anywhere, right?
That I can't answer.
Okay.
I'll have to defer to staff on that.
Yeah, that's correct, Sarah. There's no revenue factored in from selling Village Hall. As Melissa and David mentioned, I mean, this is just a scenario based on the recommendation from the study, and the phase is pushed out a few years. That's all we did to it at this point, since there's
Sure.
no decision made as far as what option to pick or anything like that.
Sure. So then there's none, so there could be potentially additional revenue there. And then, I know we don't have very much land left to sell out in Commerce Park, but when we do sell those last few parcels, where does that revenue go in our revenue stream?
That goes to TID District Number 5.
It does,
Because that
okay.
land's located within the district.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
But Sarah and Greg, maybe you can explain when the TID closes, there will be a cash balance, and that the village will get our proportional share of that, which is about 30%.
Correct. So yes, as Matt said, so when a district closes, you pay off all of your remaining costs, and if there's money left over in that TID fund, it gets proportionally split. So yeah, you'll get a one-time cash infusion. And from a levy limit perspective as well, you do get a one-time allowable increase in your allowable levy the year after a TID closure occurs, and we have factored that into this analysis.
Okay.
So when we look at your levy limit gap, in that year following that TID closure, that value goes back on, you get a partial levy limit credit for a TID closure. We're factoring that in already.
Okay, thank you.
And it's worth noting too that this levy gap is, it's not a gap in the sense that the voters would need to be asked to have a corresponding tax increase that equates to the amount of that deficit. It's really asking to continue especially looking at this scenario here, it's continuing our existing operations. And actually, it's a tax reduction in 2027.
I don't
Wait,
understand
that
what
doesn't
Matt
make any
just said.
sense.
I can,
Okay.
maybe I'll take a
Thank
stab at it.
you.
Yeah.
So if you look
We
at
still
the
meet.
chart on page 51 and look in year 2027, so we're projecting your total levy would need to be $7,826,227. Let's just say you levied that amount. 2027 is the budget year where you'll see the impact of the TID 5 closure. So even though your levy was going up from 7.3 to 7.8 million, you're collecting more money in property tax levy. Your tax rate per thousand is going down from $8.23 to $7.45. So the tax rate is going down, but while you would need your levy to be at $7.8 million, you legally couldn't levy that amount under current levy limits. If you needed to levy it though, even though your levy is going up to, cover those existing services, the tax rate's going down because of the TID closure. I believe that's what Matt was getting at.
Yes, but in 2027 in scenario 4, we're over our levy limit.
Right. So you would,
You either need to cut spending or you need to go to referendum, correct?
or both.
Or both.
But the tax amount that taxpayers pay for their property tax would actually go down, if you look
Yeah.
at the fourth line.
I get
down.
that, but
Right.
There's still the
Right.
question,
So-
there's still a question of a referendum.
Still
Yeah.
have to go to
So
referendum.
under this question, to get to the 7.8 million, you would need to do a referendum to get to that amount.
Yeah.
But if that was the amount you needed, the tax rate would still go down because the TID
Yeah.
closed.
And if the answer was no to the referendum, taxes would just go down even more beyond that.
Or, correct,
Right,
yeah, I get
right.
that, yeah.
But there would be a corresponding reduction in service, because there'd be multiple departments
Sure.
and staff that would have to.
Can we just,
The other thing to, that will need to be vetted is the state withholds shared revenue if you're exceeding the levy limit, and our shared revenue is about $50,000. So, there could be a discussion there as well as to a cost benefit there.
sure. Really quick, Greg, just to revisit Sarah's question, because I want to make sure I understood it right. If Amazon builds a building, again, conservatively 200 million, and if they do it within the window, I'm just playing a what-if scenario here, if they do it before 2027, theoretically, could that affect that levy limit gap?
Yes,
Okay,
that will help the levy limit gap. It won't eliminate it, but it'll help.
sure. And it's all based on timing, too. So
Correct.
we don't know when they're going to build.
Correct.
So it could be 29, 30, it
Right.
could be
Yeah.
whenever, right?
Whenever it gets built, you will get the immediate benefit of that from a levy limit perspective.
Levy limit, okay.
You won't from the value, because the value will still be in the TID district, but you get the immediate benefit from a levy limit perspective.
Thank you.
So based on these numbers, though, since we are looking at a deficit or a gap of almost 600,000 in 2026, we'd have to go to referendum for that year, too?
Yeah, unless you could kind of manage that gap, without necessarily having to go to a referendum. I mean, that's ultimately the question, so.
So then, if we went that route, if Amazon didn't build and we had this gap, then does that have to be on the ballot, like in November of 2025? Is there even an election in 2025?
You can do a levy limit referendum really at any election cycle. I mean, I think ideally, you would do a levy limit referendum in the spring, just because you would then know the results before you do your budget process. I mean, you can do a levy limit referendum in November. There are communities, I'm working with a community that's doing a levy limit referendum this November. They essentially have two versions of their budget, that they're kind of working on because they don't know what the outcome's going to be, and November's getting, kind of late. So you can do it.
We'd have to do it before 2026, since we.
Yeah, ideally, yeah, or at least start discussing it and planning it, maybe you do it at no later than probably spring of '26. If you want to do it sooner, that would probably be advantageous, but, yeah.
Thank you.
So just to kind of wrap up scenario 4, and then I'm going to wrap up all of this mercilessly. So if we kind of get to scenario 4 and kind of look at the big impact, debt limit, again, I mean, we've taken out, some significant contributors to the overall capital plan, so you're down to 54% of your debt limit, which there's really no concerns there. Your average levy increase per year over the next 5-year planning period is still 11%, which is higher than what you've been trending at the last couple of years, and, there's still a levy limit gap. So to kind of compare all of this, that's on the chart on page 53. Just kind of shows kind of some of those high-level metrics, where you're at with borrowing capacity, the average annual levy increase over 5 years, and kind of what that levy limit gap, tops out at by 2027, just based on the projections, in this model. So you've brought up a lot of good comments and kind of talking about kind of next steps and, how you go about managing this. And so let's kind of talk about that. In terms of kind of the financial challenges, we've looked at some pretty varied models here in terms of capital investment over a 10-year period, as much as 77 million to 35 million. So that's, there's a pretty, distinct gap. But I think to some of the points that you have all brought up, That's, need to look at all aspects of the model, looking at operations, kind of existing service levels, how those are trending, and then the impact of, the capital plan and just those dollar amounts and what can, from a borrowing capacity, what's manageable from affordability and a levy perspective, and that really kind of all comes down to broadly phasing. And prioritization in terms of, there's a lot of worthwhile things in the capital plan, but I mean, to say we can fund all of it, I'm just going to come flat out and say you can't. Not without, putting the village in a financial position I'm confident you would all regret. So I think that, that's just kind of the reality of the situation, but that's not all doom and gloom. It just means there needs to be some prioritization and revisiting in terms of what's affordable. That average annual increase, in the levy from 2019 to 2022 has been about 6%, total levy. In this model, it ranges from 11 to 17%. So, I mean, it's well above where you've been at the past couple of years. And then there's the levy limit gap, regardless of, the village campus or the library project, we're projecting that there's going to be a gap over the 5-year period, just based off of existing services. So, if you're looking at making significant changes to existing services or adding any new services, regardless of what those new services are, you're likely going to need to look at levy limits in order to fund it. So I think in terms of any commitments that you're making in terms of significant changes, having a sustainable funding mechanism in place before you commit to those would be highly recommended. Because otherwise, if you embark on, any new service, I don't care what that service is, pick a new service, you're going to, likely see some financial pressures. And that's really a function of levy limits. I mean, is there anything you've done wrong to put you in that position? No. In my opinion, the answer to that is, unequivocally no. It's just that, you're 17 years into a limit and you're seeing costs start to go up. There's pressures on that. And so you're not alone. I mean, it's very difficult for communities to add new services that aren't part of their budget under levy limits without either funding it entirely through some non-levy revenue source, which if you can do that, great, that's the preferred outcome. But if you need levy authority to pay for it, you're likely seeing a levy limit referendum. And that's very common. I mean, that's not something that's we say here that's unique. It's something we say in a lot of places. So I want to make that perfectly clear. So, in terms of budget guidance and kind of where we go from here, what was there a question? Oh.
You're about to talk about where we go from here. A lot of these slides we're looking out 5 years, which is what, we're reasonably asking you to plan for or model. Is there hope in the future for things getting, some of these pressures loosening, or is there legacy decisions that were made that'll fall off the books for the village? Are you seeing this being an ongoing problem?
This is my own opinion. I see it being an ongoing problem. My opinion, I would not be banking on legislative fixes to fix this problem, because there have been legislative proposals introduced that wouldn't fundamentally alter levy limits, but are trying to put back in that minimum increase. I mentioned years ago it was 3.86%, then it went to 2%, then it went to 0. There's been proposals, the last couple legislative sessions to put some kind of a minimum increase back in, and that hasn't changed. So, could that, I'm not saying that can't happen, but as we sit here today, I wouldn't want to be counting on that.
And as you talked about sort of services that were in place at the time levy limits were imposed in 2005, if the idea is that if your levy limit starts at a place that includes those services if you had them done, but doesn't allow you to add them if you didn't at that time.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it kind of started with your base levy, and every year you kind of start with the actual year's levy, and then they allow you to increase it from there. So, I mean, I think the village has been able to add some services incrementally over time. And that's, managed to work, and I mean, that's great, but I mean, we're just forecasting that, that we don't see that trend continuing based on what we know at the moment. And that's not a criticism, that's just kind of the reality of it.
So, based on that, then, are you saying in 2028, we're gonna have a larger gap than 1.5 if we add nothing, like the library or village campus? Like, we're just gonna keep having this huge gap?
Yeah, the pressure, it keeps going. So, I mean, the pressure continues. So, I mean, there's definitely kind of some corrective measures that kind of need to be built in here to kind of start, addressing that constraint going forward. Unless the levy limits just completely get absolved and go away, but I wouldn't want to count on that.
So it seems that we're going to be going to the taxpayers basically for referendum.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's one of your options certainly is a levy limit referendum. And as I said, I mean, you're seeing more and more communities, do that. I mean, kind of this last slide kind of puts together kind of the litany of things which the village has done well historically, and encourage you, and have no doubt you'll continue to do that. It's looking at your levy, the rate impact, what's affordable to taxpayers, what new services or initiatives, can you afford and fund under levy limits? Are there permissible decreases in service levels that could give you some financial relief? Prioritizing and phasing of capital projects to, manage that total levy impact. Acceptable levels of debt, i.e. debt management capacity, how much, debt can you, reasonably afford to repay and legally, issue at levels that are advisable, and then, maintaining good, healthy fund balance. So you've used all these strategies at various points, and you'll continue to, absent that, it's looking for significant non-levy revenue sources to bridge that budget gap. There's certain things that you may think of that, the levy limit law prohibits. There's certain services that if you fund those services now through the property tax levy and you convert a portion or all of it to property taxes, or to a user fee, you actually have to reduce your levy. Fire protection is one of those services. I mean, if you fund that now through the levy, if you went to some non-levy revenue source to pay for some or all of that, you'd have to take some amount of a levy reduction. So I mean, there's all kinds of things built into the levy limit law. Some are restrictive, some are more beneficial. So, non-levy revenue sources, but as I said in my opening comments, I mean, with Wisconsin municipalities, that's, limited. You're looking at, then, potentially a levy limit, foregoing your state shared revenue. As Matt said, do you just say, I don't want that state shared revenue payment, we won't receive it, and we'll just levy whatever we want? I mean, that's technically an option. I mean, the statutes right now, say they can only withhold your state shared revenue. This is my opinion, that I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of communities started to do that. They start looking at other revenue sources to start holding back from you. Who knows? So yeah, then it's the key is finding something that's sustainable. You can try to do some one-offs to buy you some time, and I'm not saying that that's not a bad strategy, but I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to, what services do you want to provide? Do you want to sustain those services? And how do you get a revenue stream that will allow you to do that? And I mean, levy limit referendums can be general. They can, say you want to cover, general government, public safety, public works, and capital outlay, and what dollar amount you want. It can be for 1 year. It can be for a number of years. It can be indefinite. It can be for a very specific service. There's very specific statutory criteria that has to be satisfied when you do a levy limit referendum. We help a lot of communities with that, and there's a lot of public education that needs to go into it, because it's, no disrespect to any average voter in any community, but if you read your average levy limit referendum question, it reads like a bunch of gibberish. It's not very intuitive, and so there's a lot of education that needs to go into it, because if you just walk into a ballot and read the question, it basically reads like a mathematical explanation of a levy limit worksheet, which is as exciting as it sounds. So, there's a lot that needs to be done, but these are all things to, kind of think about kind of going forward. And and to end on a, positive note, I mean, I think that's why, encourage the village to keep doing this, because I think, not all communities do this. I mean, we think every community should do this for these reasons. It allows you to see things in advance and react to them, before, you're in a budget cycle and you don't have time to put in more permanent solutions. So I think what we're looking for kind of, some next steps, I mean, we're scheduled to be back in front of the village board a week from today. If there's any, so I think, ultimately we'll be looking for some direction on, how to kind of, make some adjustments, whether it's different phasing for capital projects or other types of adjustments to kind of make this work. I mean, I think the good news is there's time to kind of deal with this, but, there's going to be some challenging decisions to make going forward. But I'll let Matt or other staff kind of interject if they want to kind of opine on where we go from here.
Hey, Greg, on your prior slide, I didn't see anything on about economic development. In other words, we have TIDs that are closing, which help us, brings back the tax roll, helps us that we have additional businesses there. Shouldn't that also be there in consideration there?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think.
Or am I missing? I'm sorry.
No, it is. I mean, I think in terms of, the TID closures and that impact on your tax rate and levy limits, we factored all of that in, into the analysis. So, I mean, that's in there. To the extent that you see economic development, as we've been talking about, that helps your net new construction percentage, whether that's in a TID or outside a TID. So yes, I mean, these were kind of more literal financial techniques, but yes, economic development is, it benefits you in many ways in terms of diversifying your tax base, helping you, helps your allowable levy under levy limits as well. This was intended to be a fully exhaustive list. It was just kind of more the high level financial approaches.
Questions from committee, boards?
I don't have a question, maybe it's more of a comment, but, I think when we had the architect study done, we intentionally didn't have them include anything about the library. We hadn't had the EMS and fire study yet to know about the potential suggestion for another EMS building. And so I'm wondering if it wouldn't make sense, I know this wouldn't be for next week, because that would be too quick, but if we couldn't engage another consultant to take all of that into consideration and come up with a more comprehensive proposal that might include all of those instead of 3 separate proposals and building recommendations, that's one thing that I'm thinking about. I'm not sure others' thoughts.
And I'm thinking we could always do that, right? We could have an architect or a firm come in, but I think that like a working session, just to understand what's in it now, now. I mean, I agree with you, but at the same point, we're going to get another study that comes out of it that says, okay, you should do it in these phases, right? But that doesn't necessarily take into account the levy limits, you know what I mean? So if we could get just wondering if there's enough knowledge in this room, if we could do some of that work on our own and have it validated, you know what I mean? I just think that when I did the tour, the one thing that stuck out at me was all the indoor parking for all the vehicles. That's a huge need, right? But as far as I know, is that in phase 1 or is that in phase 2? It's in phase 2, right? So to me, and again, this is my opinion, right? You all took the tour too, but to me, it was parking all these, all these vehicles that we spend a ton of money on, to me seems like a more important usage of those funds, but it's in phase 2, and it's, years later, it's a few years later. So it's just to me, it goes back to that prioritization process, right? I think like Melissa said, we haven't talked about it. This is really the first time we've talked about the village campus study. So I think there's like some sort of working group, I don't know. There, sometimes I want to go to ask an expert before, but then,
I know.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking, it sounds like we probably will have to go to a referendum at some point. And would it make sense to have a more comprehensive plan that we could share that has been validated? Because I know I didn't go to any sort of school for training for coming up with wild facility ideas. But yeah, I'm curious to hear others' thoughts. It was just my initial reaction.
So remember, you have the levy limits and you have debt capacity. So you have two levers that have been pushed on us by this law. So probably what you need to do is essentially you got to stretch all of this debt out multiple years, more than anybody would ever want, and then come back and prioritize which one comes first. And then you can kind of evaluate the levy limit impact as well as debt. I mean, but unfortunately, it's beyond 5 years is what you kind of got to plan for these things, because we can see what the 5 years looks like. And then hopefully, magically, enough communities will speak up and the legislation will change their mind and at least allow a little bit, the 3.86% or instead of 0 or something, so that it gives communities a little bit of wiggle room to do some of these things. Because otherwise you're stuck in this spinning circle. And you can't really make a huge impact like, a growing community like ours wants to.
What's interesting is that our taxes go down, though, despite our levy limit needing to increase. And we have heard about the lack of space for vehicles, which, and also the lack of space for staff. It's all. But I feel like there's ways around those issues that isn't building a full campus right away, too. And so I think that's kind of what I think about when Sarah brings up a study. Looking at all those different things is taking into account if we were to build a library, what other staff could be in that building until we're making do with Village Hall and the municipal building and converting spaces in that instance. And building just a garage is a lot cheaper than building a whole new Village Hall or campus too. So those would be the type of things that I would want looked at, on how, if we did build a library first, if that could be a space for some staff there as well, until we get to the point where we can then build a better village campus, as it's called. The other thing, too, that if we are going to be going to referendum, which seems to be the case in a few years, I think that then the voters would be able to then decide on whether they want a library at that point, rather than just being part of it to have the levy limit increase, to continue services, to then have it also be whether they want to pay for the additional library services at that point. Because part of economic development is giving people in our community a space to go, and that brings in new businesses and people as well. So if we continue to want to have our community be thriving, we need to give places for residents and new people to come in to then go to our businesses while they're in our community. So those are my initial thoughts.
Just a quick follow-up on, well, I agree, in the statement that the taxes go down, they only go down from year 2026 to 2027. In the other years, I'm looking at scenario 4 even, they're going up. So I just wanted to call out that they would eventually come back down, but probably not to the level they are today. So,
Right, and we don't know what they do in the next 6 years. But if we're gonna have this huge gap,
yeah, I just wanted to clarify that taxes will go up, it's just then they will
Right.
come back down. a little
but
bit.
they go up before we get to that levy gap.
Yes. They go up, and then we hit the levy gap, and then they come down when we hit the levy gap, yes.
And that's with nothing in there. So remember that, there's nothing in there, which is kind of scary. Other than inflationary and maybe a few staff here or there, but that's it.
I had a question about hypothetical referendum then. Would that then write our course? Like if it was asked in the right way, like would it then reset us, this is now our levy and then we can increase from there within the net new construction?
Yeah, so under levy limits, you kind of have a couple of different, you have to specify what it's for. So whether it's kind of a general combination of services or a specific service, that's policy decision number 1. Policy decision number 2 is the duration. So is it a levy limit increase for the next fiscal year, depending on when you're doing it? Is it for so many years, and you have to specify the number of years, or is it, indefinite? So let's start with kind of the indefinite. So say, I'm just making up a number, say it was $50,000, you want to do a levy limit increase for that amount. So if that, and you specify what it was for, that passes, every year on the levy limit worksheet, after you get your allowable adjustment for net new construction, and your permitted debt adjustments, and if any other adjustments apply, you can add on another $50,000 every year, indefinitely if it's indefinite. And then answer changes to basing on the duration. If it's for 5 years, you get it for 5 years. But it's built in once you do that. They don't, if you did it for 5 years, at the end of 5 years, they don't back it all out. So I mean, that's why it's a meaningful approach, because it provides you immediate and ongoing levying capacity.
So we could then ask an additional question. So one, these are the services we have now. We would exceed the limit to provide those, and then you could add, as Melissa suggested, then it would be that in addition, you could do the library would be an extra above. Like we have the flexibility to ask questions like that.
Yeah, you could have multiple questions on one ballot. And, you can technically do that. I mean, I think, I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. I just think if you did that, that's going to require a fair amount of coordination and just an education on the front end, just to make it clear that it's not, it's A or B. I mean, that's the hard part. There's no way on a ballot to necessarily say, well, here's one scenario, here's 2 scenarios. It all just looks like multiple scenarios. So.
Yeah, because you wouldn't want to be stuck with a second question and not.
Right.
Like,
right.
Yeah.
Your concern is, and I've worked with communities that have had kind of operational levies and, debt financing, referendums on the same ballot. So, the concern, would be one pass and one doesn't. So, you got your operating levy approved to fund X service. You need, if you decide to take the capital financing to a referendum as well, you can pay for the operations, but to issue the bonds to pay the building, it failed. What do you do under that situation? So, so yes, you have options, but I mean, it's trying to find a path forward that everyone can reasonably understand.
Sure. And then kind of tying in our debt capacity with sort of what Sarah was talking about earlier, like I'd be interested to know, and I know it's hard to estimate because it's across many years, like what would be a reasonable amount that we could consider for capital projects to stay under that 75%? Like, is our universe that we could actually think about doing village improvements and, whichever size library?
Yeah, I think how we can answer that question is we can just model out, if you did X amount of borrowing per year, this is kind of how you would get up to that point. It could kind of stay at that point. And, it's easier just to focus on a gross dollar amount, say this is the amount, and then that's what you have to work with for whatever capital projects you deem appropriate.
Yeah, I definitely would not want to go above the 75%, and that's what's advised, and, we don't want to,
And,
be ready for rainy day.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the projects in the capital list that we modeled tonight, I mean, there were some small utility components, but they were pretty small. I mean, if you have larger utility investments, you can finance those with revenue debt, where you're legally pledging, water and sewer revenues to repay the debt service, and that doesn't count towards the limit. So I think that's likely part of the village's debt issuance going forward. And I mean, and then there's other revenue financing options available as well, but that falls under the umbrella of blight elimination. So I mean, you can fund some infrastructure or even some facilities, but you have to be doing that under the onus that you're addressing blighted conditions.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Ellers?
I mean, not a question, but the library board has considered we'd go to referendum for the library project. It's in our timeline for 2024.
Right, but in the scenarios here, it'd have to be outside of 25 because we already have an issue with our existing services, unless the board decides otherwise.
Is that, in your consideration, Cindy, is that for operational and capital or just operational?
I don't know what the question would be, like on the ballot. I'm
I think
assuming it would.
Operational.
Has to be both.
Yeah.
It has to be both.
It has to be?
Yeah. No?
No,
I
Okay.
think so.
it doesn't have to be on the capital side, but I mean, I to my earlier point, if you're, and, if you're getting the authority to pay for the operations, you also, you want to have you want people to understand and understand the capital side is as well. So it may not be required, but it comes down to making sure they understand, there's an understanding that if you're adding any new service and there's a capital side of it, that at least that's understood.
Yeah, it's basically being transparent to the voter,
Yeah.
saying it's all of this.
Yeah, I think if you're, as I said earlier, if you're looking at adding any new service, within kind of this planning window, I think you're likely looking at a levy limit at a minimum for the operational side. Unless there's a non-levy revenue source that you have available to pay for.
So we're not legally bound to have a capital referendum, but to John's point, for transparency, it would be nice for the voters. I think is what I'm hearing.
For a library, you can issue, so,
Because
if you issue bonds for certain types of projects under state law, certain types of projects require a bond referendum. A library is not one of those projects. But I also want to say for the projects that do require a referendum, legally it is very easy to avoid that referendum, which is why you rarely see a municipality do a capital bond referendum, because they are easily avoidable, and that's perfectly legal. Most communities, if they do a bond referendum, they are doing it out of choice, not out of necessity. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do one or can't. I'm just saying for many capital items, it's completely avoidable.
And so on that the worksheet that you showed us, that was library only, that was capital and operating together?
Correct.
Right.
And I guess, what does of these three scenarios, what does the library board, what's your preference of 4.4, 7.1, is it, and 12.5?
It's 4.4, 7.1, and 12.5.
Did the library board make a determination of what?
So we didn't have this information from Ellers until Friday. And we met on Wednesday, so we didn't have the tax impact. I have a handout if you'd like a handout.
But I mean, just as far as
Take one and pass it
the, I know that there's like all included is like the 12.5, like everything.
down. Right.
And
So
I forget what the level
from
are. High,
a
moderate.
library board perspective,
Yeah.
obviously we're advocating for the best library in Cottage Grove, and that would be at the $12.5 million price tag. So in the handout, I don't know if you read the agenda from last Wednesday that had everything in there. This is an abbreviated version that I put together. So, I mean, it outlines the 3 scenarios, and if you actually look on page 2, I think libraries aren't, we've repeated this a million times, right? They're not just a place for books. It's a meeting place for the community. It's different programming spaces. It's cultural arts space. It's all of that. So if you look through scenarios 1, 2, and 3, you really see that special use area, and like what you lose when you go down to scenario 2 and scenario 3. So I think scenario 3, I was asked to give what would meet the minimum requirements to build a library here, and that's what you see in scenario 3, and that is bare minimum. I mean, that is a 40-person reader seating. It is a 50-seat meeting room that's 600 square feet. That is less than half the size of the boardroom. It's like a third the size of this. I think scenario 2, I think that might be a good meeting place, meeting in the middle. If there is going to have to be compromise, out of that $77 million bucket of projects, I think and if the library is going to compromise, I think that might be our middle ground. And obviously the library board is recommending scenario 1. I mean, I think that's everything that the community is looking for. It's everything that we've gone to all the libraries in Dane County and we've seen what other libraries have. And I added in here too, we had a special use space discussion on Wednesday. And these are, the extra spaces that the library board came back with as their, top 3 extra spaces. And that's adding square footage, right? So it's going to increase the capital cost if you add in extra spaces like that. In terms of the operating costs, really, I think we did a good job putting together the best we can at this point of what operating costs would be. And obviously operational, costs are dictated by, your staff mostly. That's 80% of your operational budget. So at the lowest, 7 is our bare minimum FTEs that's required by Dane County, but we move up to 9 in scenario 2 and 11 in scenario 1.
And the space in there, the space that is allocated for those FTEs, so it's not coming up with more space for those FTEs, so it's all built in.
Right.
And there's requirements, so you have so much non-public space for those FTEs to go and do their work. And that's built into that.
Right. If you go into the agenda from last week, you can see all of the space needs worksheets that I worked with Deb from South Central.
Is there the population requirement, like right now we're under 10,000?
I've done my work on it.
Yeah.
We're solid. So it's all from a 10,000 to 25,000 resident population. Scenario 1 does take into consideration a service area too. So really a population, so the expanded service area that's not just village residents. And scenario 2 and 3, we cut it down to just focusing on village residents, not extra square footage budget in there at all.
Then my last question.
But we are at the 10 to 25,000, and looking at population projections from both South Central and from Matt and from the school district, we are good until 2045 plus. I'm confident in saying that.
At all 3 scenarios?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So if you go on that space need worksheet, I have 9,800 in some spots. It is 10 to 25, I promise.
Melissa did her.
That's all right.
She definitely did her homework.
The other thing is, do you know how big the Sun Prairie Library currently is?
37,000?
35. And then they're
37.
expanding up to 60.
Yeah.
Their library is huge right now.
Right. They're 35. But
They're much
If
larger.
you go into my spreadsheet, I have it.
It's 37, if I.
Is it 37?
It's
Oh,
currently
yeah.
37 going up.
They're at a different population.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Right. No, they're
much-
at that next level. So at 25,001, you jump up into like the next tier of population service that you have to provide.
Right, yeah, no, I
have to
just
get
was
there.
trying to get a sense in my brain what,
Right. So I
That's
think the 25,000 is comparable to Monona.
Monona's
Monona's
at
27.
27,000.
McFarland is 17,000.
right, and they're, McFarland's building new or addition.
I think if you talk to any librarian, they're going to say they're out of space.
Yeah.
You know, there's always more space that's needed.
Deerfield is expanding, right?
Right. Deerfield's
And I-
expanding. Oregon.
doubling their size up to 8,000 square feet from 4,000.
So they're 4,000 right now?
Yeah.
Deerfield, okay.
But I mean, 10,000. We can't go any less than 10,000.
Right,
I think when you look at slide 29, this is not the first iteration of this slide that we've seen on the library board. The first one was drastically different. When I look at this slide and then I think about a referendum is a foregone conclusion at some point, right, over the next 10 years, safe to say. Like, to me, this whole conversation is not necessarily about the library, this is more about the village campus project and talking about how to prioritize things. We continually, as a village board, we continue to make the library our number one priority. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think, and I think we've all made comments about, the village campus study. I think to me, that's where I think our focus as a board needs to go from here, knowing that the library is our number one priority, a referendum is a foregone conclusion. And, just based on this slide alone, I mean, from where we were to where we're at now, I mean, this is night and day compared to where we were at one point. And I remember, having a very candid conversation with Cindy around like where we were and where I thought we should be, and like we did better than I thought we could this particular slide. So I think, again, I'll just reiterate, I think it's the village campus project is really the center of the conversation here, not necessarily the library.
I think having the library board here tonight, I mean, we're looking for direction from you as to where we should be putting our efforts, a 10,000 square foot library or a 25,000 square foot library. That change, I mean, we need, for us to move forward with our goals and our timeline, we're looking for direction from you tonight.
Is there a consideration for changing the timeline? Because we already changed it for the facilities needs, which, moving it out, would we consider that for this? Scenario one is what the library board wants, is not feasible from a debt capacity as well as levy,
well, nothing's feasible.
right?
Well, that's the,
don't have a scenario that just involves the library, so it's hard to.
right, I mean, scenario 4 removes everything, right, but it also removes the library. So what happens in scenario 4 when you just put the library back in and you remove either the village campus or you move those other projects out further?
That goes back to my earlier point about some sort of a working group. Like, this is all one big game of Tetris and just trying to work with the calendar. And I think that, and again, I need to look at Ellers here, but like, I'm not a financial expert, but I can tell you when you slot things in certain years, it has an impact, good, bad, and indifferent, on the debt limit and the levy limit. So I think if we were to have a working session, like, if David ran the world for a day, I'd love to sit down as a small working group and have Ellers there, and we can throw options and watch how the abacus changes. I don't know if that's feasible. I don't know if we can do that. But I mean, if we could, because what we do is we do these things, right? And then we send them to Ellers, and then it's a week or two before we hear back. And again, I'm not trying to discount, I don't know how hard your work is, right? So I don't know if it's an Excel spreadsheet or if there's some dude with a calculator somewhere hammering away. But I'm just thinking, like, again, best case scenario, if David could have everything he wants, we could sit with a calendar, look long-term, slot things in, and then have Greg and team tell us, here's how it's going to impact you, so that we can eventually string this thing out so far that we get everything that we want in the timeline that works and doesn't impact the debt limit and the levy limit.
When I think from the library perspective, we put together our timeline to obviously accomplish that goal, but also so that we aren't, construction costs aren't continually going up, and we are, pushing this out, and then we're ending up with a more expensive borrowing in 2029 or something like that.
That's the case with everything, though. So you
But,
could,
I
you
mean,
could
just
say
as
that
the number
same
one
thing-
priority, we just put this together as,
But you could
this
say
is
that
our
for the
timeline.
same thing as village, fire truck, anything these days. It doesn't matter. It's when you have the funds. So in this case, scenario 4, it says we don't have the funds without the library, without the village thing, moving a bunch of things out in addition to that, roads and some other things, and we still don't have the funds. You have to move that library out beyond 26, 27 in order to even start working on a timeline to start slotting things in.
Yeah, but at some point, legislatively, nothing's going to change. Anything.
Absolutely.
So you're saying that if I look at option 4 here, like, even the things that we do have, and I'm looking at slide 48, what you're saying, John, is that the big ticket items in this have to move out years in advance, is what I think I'm hearing.
I mean, you have to look at the library, if, again, that's the top priority, it has to be out beyond 27. The village stuff is gonna have to be parsed out because that's a lower priority and probably reduced dramatically.
But this doesn't include any new staff.
Exactly, well,
This
there's,
doesn't include, like, there's an awful lot of things here that, in this long-term debt, like, you're cutting things to the bare minimum. And again, like Greg said, like, municipalities are going to referendum more often. It's going to become it's a foregone conclusion for us at any point in the future. And what you're saying is, like, the problem here is that our residents want new services, but what you're saying is you can't have them until we can pay for them. But likelihood, it might be 10, 15 years before we can have those services.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the structure from the 2005 law has put us in this spot. That's the reality we have. Each year, even in scenario 4, we add a few staff. That is what we've been operating on. This last year, we were fortunate, we added 4 staff. But each year, it's 1 or 2 staff in our baseline. So in this baseline, there's a couple staff each year for those next 5 years. That's kind of in those workings. When you're talking about a library, you're talking 11 or 7 or, I can't remember the last scenario.
11, 9, or 7.
We have 37 staff now. You know what, do the math, that's 30% increase. So what I'm saying is, let's plan it out, but you gotta push the library out beyond where it's at now. We're already pushing everything else out, why should that be pushed out? It doesn't make sense. Larry's got his hand up.
Greg and Jonathan, if, just based on your understanding of this model, and I know you haven't done this analysis, or you don't have a scenario like this, but as I think Cindy said, we don't have a scenario where we've moved the things in scenario 4, eliminated the village campus changes, and then with the library in. Can you give us a general idea or how things would move, like in the directions they would move if we had the library on scenario 2, capital and operations in 25, 26, 27, 28, what that would do? I think the biggest limiting factor at this point is the debt capacity, right? That's not something we can move away from via referendum. And so, I was actually very surprised tonight to see that debt capacity number change so little, with big chunks of dollars coming out of them. From scenario 1 to scenario 2, you're almost cutting the library in half in terms of the cost, at least for the capital. So let's say under scenario 2, you got a some odd $7 million library and 9 FTEs operational cost. Can you give us a general thought as to what that would look like if that was run, and whether or not pushing it out to 27 would even make a difference? Because it seems to me that the debt capacity that you'd hit, or if there's a way to structure that debt in a way that you wouldn't hit that 86% or 90% debt capacity.
No, it kind of gets back to the scenario I was talking about, to keep it at a little higher level, as if you just said, okay, over the next so many years, if you wanted to gradually kind of get to that 75% geo debt capacity utilization, what does that give you in terms of borrowing capacity in terms of dollar amounts to work with towards projects. Because I can appreciate there's a lot of discussion on the village campus and the library project, but, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't say there's everything else that there's still in here as well. I mean, street repairs, some of the park improvements and everything else. And, all of it can't get done. I think you all clearly understand that. But I think it's, understanding this is the dollar amount we have to work with for all of it. And, how can we fit that in? I mean, we can run some very specific scenarios, but, and I'm not saying we can't, but I think it'd be helpful just to say, what's the total dollar amount we have to work with? That's what we have to work with. Can we fit in a library? Can we fit in street improvements, park improvements, and things of that nature?
Greg will get mad if I don't say anything at all. So, I was going to say back to your earlier point about a working group to work through these things. I think that would be a step in the right direction. I think in general would be a more robust capital improvements planning process, and what Greg is talking about, where we can come up with what your top line dollar amount is, and then work down from that. What that involves, though, is coming up with kind of a scoring system, right? How do you prioritize different projects? And there's a lot of communities that have really good examples of that. And I think that would be, one way to help yourself out of this, because you get to a point where you realize that the dollars that you're competing with between a potential library and a potential village campus and a potential, they're also competing with, upgrading a street that is vastly deteriorated and other things. So finding ways to kind of create that prioritization and scoring is also another kind of step in the right direction to head.
Jonathan, I'm really glad you spoke up. It's nice to hear you. I would say, as a board, we do a prioritization process every year, but you can put anything on it that you want. I think to have a sister process to that, where we talk about capital prioritization every year, I think would go a long way. And I don't know what that looks like, right? But I think, though, like, even for this, we clearly have a laundry list of things that we want to do. I can only speak for myself. There's a lot of things on this list that I have no idea what's in them. And I could tell you at a cursory level, but that's even a stretch. But I think, again, if we could sit down and do a prioritization process, and maybe the compromise is here, Jonathan, as much as I want to hang out with you, but and have you, like, we do a working session, maybe the compromise here is the board does a prioritization process, and then you and Greg tell us what to get to that 75%. Okay, here board, here's what you get to spend in the next 5 years to get you that 75% and to keep you on an even keel. And you can do it over this amount of time. And that way, every year, we just do our prioritization process and say, okay, here's the projects you get to, if you want bigger stuff done sooner, you get fewer projects done, right? And then maybe some years you have a catch-up, you do some smaller ones, right? So do you have any municipalities that do anything like that today?
Yes, and I would say, not that they're shooting towards that 75%, I wouldn't necessarily want to put that as like the place that you want to get to.
Sure.
There are some other kind of best practices, like, not issuing an amount that exceeds the amount of principal you pay off every year. There's other ways that you can kind of structure it, but there are communities that they say, here's my top line, and then we'll kind of work down from that using a priorities process.
Okay. Yeah, I think, and I just use 75 as a, but if you're recommending something lower, like a 50% or whatever that number might be, right? And then we just work towards that number with the prioritization process. I think that's the compromise here. I think.
David, I'll just add, like you mentioned, some of these things are new or the scope's expanded in here, but the roads we could almost describe as a want. So as you're talking about this, NBB, crop, those are larger road, pedestrian, bike type thoughts that we don't have a whole lot of detail on, but we wanted to work with Strain to just get a high concept number. But as you're talking about this and how you want to move forward, definitely those are our roads and our ped bike infrastructure. Those are wants to some extent. So a lot of those numbers are a lot more flexible too.
I get it.
I guess I'm sort of hearing like a kind of working backwards prioritization, what's our capacity? What I would like to get to is like, it sounds like we're gonna have to go to referendum. And what is the reasonable, we've done our homework, we think that this is a reasonable ask to taxpayers if they want these various services, and just that we've done the groundwork to try to provide what, what the community's asking for and what our responsibilities are, and kind of present that in a timeline that is achievable, although it may end up being longer than we would have all liked, but that's the constraints we operate under. So I don't know if I necessarily have a specific, like, what do we then look at on Monday? Because I don't,
Right, that was
I
my
don't
next
think,
question.
right, I don't think that this is going to be doable by Monday.
I think, we like detail. I mean, when we get these detailed project lists, that's how we prefer to kind of put these models together. But I think at the same time, at this point, there's broader things that have to be addressed. So kind of taking that broader step back and just kind of focusing on some gross dollar amounts to work with, seeing what that levy impact is at a broader sense. So you kind of, because I mean, we're talking about, where do you want to get to, or the max amount you may want to get to on a debt limit. But, just as important, I would say, argue more important, the question is, are you willing to levy a tax to pay for that? And that's built into these numbers, but I think, you're going to have to prioritize. So, I think having a detailed list, while helpful, because then we know what we've incorporated into the model, taking a step back and saying, here's some broad dollar amounts to work with, and this is going to have to address your capital needs, infrastructure, facilities, and however you choose to define it. But it's, I think it's going to be all those things, and there's, it's likely going to be, not where it's not going to meet the needs that were probably identified, but at least it gives you some kind of targets to work within. And then you have these lists to kind of refer back to and say, this is kind of what's been put together. So.
I just wanted to add on to that one quick thing, which is, I think Greg's point about taking a step back is important, because I think, just gathering what we've walked through the last couple months with staff and some of the feedback we've had over the last year. I guess where we sit right now, it just doesn't seem like there's a feasible way to go to meet all of what everybody wants in this room. So I think that step back and in other words, not kind of moving in a specific direction at this time, because there's no feasible way to get there.
I mean, I think our main thing that we want to do is keep the multi-year concept in front of you, keep the full budget concept in front of you, because it's very easy to look at projects as a one-off and just say, oh, that impact isn't that bad. But that's not how decisions get made. I mean, you're funding services, you're funding other capital needs, and that's why these integrated models we think are helpful, because it just doesn't isolate. I mean, it's helpful to know how much a certain project costs, I get that, but at the end of the day, that's not how you're putting your budget together. So, I think that's why we can dial this back a little bit and give you some broader context to react to, but at least then we can run these scenarios till we pass out, but I also think, and, I almost got to that point, but, the reality of it is there's only so many of these things you want to look at, and so many of these I want to talk about, but that's the second part.
Can you go back to the 75%? And we've talked a lot about that. I'm trying to, is that a kind of a Wisconsin standard? Is that something from your consulting firm? Is that, I talked a little bit about changing the bond rating. Can you refresh my memory?
Yeah, so I think the limit where you go to is kind of, dependent on kind of the size of the community. It's all a function of the size and value of your community. I mean, larger metropolitan size cities with a huge tax base, we don't have these conversations about borrowing limit, because, the legal amount they could borrow, no one in their right mind would ever borrow that amount. I mean, I work with a community that has, several billion of tax base. We don't talk about debt limit. I mean, I show them the capacity projection, and we all just kind of laugh because there's no way they're ever going to borrow that amount. But for smaller size communities, it's a real limitation. So from there, it's, you know, trying to find that appropriate, I mean, about 75% is usually about the upper limit that we recommend for smaller to medium-sized communities. I mean, do some go higher than that? Yes, but I mean, it's, so I mean, we're kind of setting that parameter. But I mean, again, it needs to be kind of a gradual and thoughtful a way that you're getting at that amount. Because, you know, if it just happens overnight or looks like it's just kind of being done in a vacuum, and I'm not saying it would be, that's when the rating agencies get concerned. I mean, I have another community I work with that is debating a lot of these exact same types, I mean, literally, these same projects, library, parks, the whole gamut. And, you know, they're going to get to about 75% of their borrowing limit. They had a policy that said they would not exceed 50% of their debt limit. That's like, well, what are you going to do? You're not going to get, they amended their policy, but we started planning for this years in advance. They have the same rating as Cottage Grove. And so far, the rating agencies have been accepted of it because they understand what it's for. It's been made in a very deliberate process, a lot of public involvement, and, you know, there's thought behind it. It's just if you just go out and borrow a bunch of money, you know, that's not good practice. So that's where it comes from.
So if we do more planning, it sounds like that's what we're missing is a little more planning here. And we document that there is some precedence out there that we can go up to that or a little over that as long as we
Yeah,
have a plan and we can show it's going to come back down.
Yeah, there's no guarantee that even if you get up to that amount that you may not see downward pressure on your rating. But I think if you go about it the right way and you're going about it the right way, you know, I think there's a story to tell there, and it's all just about kind of how it's presented and showing that you're doing due diligence and it's thought out. It's just when it just happens, you know, the village is in the bond market fairly regularly. You know, if you're going to do these types of projects that you're talking about, you had a rating call earlier this summer, a year from now, if you just did some of these things out of nowhere, the reaction's going to be pretty negative. Because I'm like, where was this? You know, if you start telling them about it in advance, hey, and we tell them about all these plans, it's just, you know, they don't like surprises. Who does? Yes, you took the words out of my mouth.
So, and it sounds like what a couple decisions we'll have to make fairly quick is for the 2023 budget, so, right, I mean, next week and going forward, and, so like the library architectural design, 720, I'm looking at slide 19, just so you know, the 500,000 for the emergency services station, 1.6 for Bakken Park, and 100,000 for community park look to be the capital pieces on there. And alternative 4 had in there everything but the 720,000. Is that right? Everything but the library.
It removed the village stuff, but the village stuff was so far out, it didn't impact next couple of years.
Okay.
It doesn't really impact till 28, 27.
Okay.
So that's why you don't see it necessarily there.
Okay. I
So it's out
wonder,
too.
I mean, JJ, your comment was interesting about the streets. I guess when I look at this, I assume that means that the staff really want these things on here. So it might be helpful, at least for me, to know what the priority would be for those street things up to that we're seeing, the bike paths, and maybe not tonight necessarily, but as we prepare to go into these different scenarios, that might be helpful. I wonder if, Ehlers, would you be comfortable putting in some conservative number on what you think the Amazon project could do to our tax levy, and where that would, what that would impact?
Greg, isn't that already in there? You said earlier that it's, a conservative number is in for Amazon already, for the levy.
We've been a little more conservative on it from the levy limit gap calculation, but we've kind of accounted for it elsewhere. So we could adjust that a little bit and see what that does to the levy limit gap. I mean, it would help significantly. I mean, it's not, but it won't eliminate it, but it'll make a meaningful improvement. We'll just kind of agree on what the timing would be.
But not for 23.
No, yeah,
No.
right.
No.
Correct, yeah, it doesn't impact 23.
Yes, right. I don't know for 2023 if it would, without knowing how all of the scenarios would look out, if it makes sense to include the 720,000 architectural and some of the other pieces. I'm not sure.
Well, that then goes to whatever timeline those things have. So,
Right.
again, that's where the scenarios, the existing ones were the existing timelines. And we know that's a problem, debt-wise. So something's got to shift. That's what I said before. So we got to start deciding what those shifts are. And it will impact 23.
And then for 23, even if you don't hit the debt capacity limit and certainly not the levy limit, if you're going to spend money on, $720,000 on A&E on the library, that I think there will be an expectation from your public that you're going to be building a library, right? Because that's a big dollar amount. And so you got to take that into account too, that, what's going to be the timing of when are you going to ask? How specifically are you going to ask the question of the public? And what are you going to spend before you ask that question? So that's something you all have to wrestle with, right? And I think that there's some challenge to, you'd really like to have the information from the A&E, right? To take to the to use in your efforts to educate and to talk to the public about what the facility would look like and be and how it would function. But you'll have to wrestle with whether you spend that money to get that information, which would be helpful, before you know if you're going to be building one, and if so, when.
And you could actually do it for a lot less if we just want concept. Because I don't think someone's going to want to know where the plumbing is. They'll just want to know what the building generally looks like, and that's how you position it to the residents, I think.
Which is what I think we asked for in our budget.
I thought you asked for the whole A&E.
Well, I mean, I think in our last meeting, we talked about how, I think that's the total amount, but it would be spread over the 3 years.
Once you commit with an architecture firm, you commit to that amount of money. So that's the struggle. So that's why if you say we just need renderings, and you go with the firm and say that's all we need, we're not building out a building yet, that's a lot less cost, $30,000 to $40,000. And then that way you're not over committing. And then once you hear from the voters, then the spend, they say yes, then it's go.
Right, the architecture firm would probably want that work with hopes that then you would select them if it would go forward. I mean, they would want to do a good job because you could come back to them, I would think.
Right, yeah. And yeah, that would make sense.
Right, kind of like with the facilities, I'm sure that they were very comprehensive in presenting their thoughts with hopes that they would then get to design if we moved forward with it. So then back to 2023 that Sarah was talking, so then we'd be at a smaller number to come up with those sort of concepts as like our first step to presenting to voters. I don't know how we come up with a number that would be.
Yeah, I really would like to see, though, somebody take all three of these kind of new building things that we need to do and give us a new concept or idea and a new price. I don't like the piecemeal approach. So if that's what I'd like to see money invested in looking at that scenario with those three pieces. Maybe it includes a rendering and other further details that you guys don't have that you're looking for from the library. But that's what I'd like to see we spend the money on so that we can have a better, more comprehensive picture. But
sure, and I like that idea of looking at it all together and then taking the financial piece. Like we know the amount we're working with, so asking the firm then, this is how much we have to do these things, and we want to achieve, you know, a library that meets, you know, at least the minimum criteria, and this is how much money we have to work with over this much time.
Probably half of what we put up there. 40 million. Ish, maybe less.
Cindy, what was the budget request for next year? Because I was looking through
For
this
which
week's agenda, because like you said, I want to, because it was much smaller than that, and I think you've got the RFP put together. I just feel like,
Like if you go into our agenda from last Wednesday.
yeah, I'm looking
you
at
go
it,
to
but I just,
budget,
I guess
budget
I'm
justification.
challenging what John was saying, like, once you start with an architectural firm, like, I figured there's got to be a way to structure this with an architectural firm where we don't have to commit to everything.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. is
Wouldn't that be
you
in the
do
RFP?
conceptual-
Well, yeah, but
Like you would
I
outline
mean,
that in
you
the
and I,
RFP without,
Cindy, you and I have heard this multiple times. People have told us that when you start this work, you have to see it through to the end. And I've never done this before, but like there just has to be a way that you can divvy this up into pieces so that you
That's-
don't have to commit to everything.
That's why I said you use concept with a firm to do the conceptual drawings. You don't say that you're building a library yet. You just say, we want this so that we can go out and essentially market it to residents and show them what it could look like. And then you've got that information. If the board and the residents and everybody likes that, you just then take that to the next firm that actually then has to build out all the bits in between. If you get that, you know, yes, and then it's a commitment. Because then you're committed to building.
Sure. I mean,
And that's what it's,
yeah.
to Larry's point, you gotta,
I agree. I think
so I think that's
fits-
written in, it's number 4 in the budget.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty much exactly what y'all have stated.
So this is the space needs and design engineering of the village library, financial impact $35,000 needs assessment, schematic development and design development of the estimated construction costs. So that's what.
So it's like half of the 780.
yeah, but what Sarah's saying is she wants that in context with everything
Everything else.
and saying, okay, what does this look like? Because somebody could say, come along and say, you know what, if you built library, community center with a village hall, you know, you have a community center in the middle and the 2 pieces on the end, it'd be X million less. I don't know, it may be more, who knows? But there may be some scaling of costs and things like that where everybody gets a little bit of what they want, not necessarily what they really want, but, you know.
Or
you
maybe
get-
some programming space from campus comes over to the library. Alternatively.
Yeah, it's hard to work. I mean, it can be challenges working with an independent library board from what I've seen with other communities. Not saying that would happen here, but I've seen it and read it. So that's the only caveat you have to put on that one.
Do you think, Cindy, would the library board be open to working with an architectural firm that would take into consideration the other facility needs of the village?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our facilities committee is looking at engineering firms that have library expertise, and that's
Yeah.
something that we would obviously want.
Yeah, that would make good sense.
But I mean, we're pretty good at collaborating and working together, and I don't envision that as a problem.
Because I wonder if there was a way to somehow combine the 720,000 and the 500,000 that's in the 2023 column for the emergency services station, and maybe it's less, and maybe we can get a more comprehensive plan.
Sarah, we would need to change 2024 construction for the emergency services station, which impacts other things
Yep.
on downward from that. So
Yep.
we would need architectural work to begin
Yeah,
in 23 and 24 for that project as it moves forward.
For other reasons.
Sure, but we could at least get an initial concept, and then maybe there's more in that line item for.
I'm with you. I'm with you, sir. There's no reason why we can't do this in phases, right? Like a phase 0 here is library, update and an update of what the last facility studies did, just so that we could get a holistic idea. And then we do the action, like, do something a little bit more sophisticated afterwards. I mean, I think we just need to go to RFP and see what's the market look like, and see if they're, you know, are we crazy here for thinking this? I don't think we are, right? I think we just need to go to an RFP, and we'll be smarter.
David,
about it.
I was just suggesting that the emergency services station may need to be separated from that.
Yeah, because it's got to move ahead at a timeline.
That's fair. But I guess what I'm trying to bolster is that we look at these numbers on this spreadsheet and think of it as like they're etched in stone, and there's ways to span multiple years. Like there's a myriad of ways to look at this and how we spend this money. I think the key is just flexibility here, like in terms of having experts tell us what we should do and when we should do it. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
I think at this point with that, leaving it in there gives us the most options moving forward, because if I agree with an updated study that will help us to understand the different aspects of the facilities we're looking at now, because there's kind of new things going on. And by leaving the $720,000 in there at this point, that doesn't mean that we borrow for it right away. When we need it is when we borrow for it. And so if at that point when the study were to come back, one way or the other, we'd either have it available, or then we like, okay, then this kind of sets our course too.
You might want a referendum in between there.
Well,
At least advisory.
it's $720,000 for 2023.
I'm getting back to what Larry said. If you commit to that, people are going to want to expect the library within the time frame that's said. So you should let folks know what that's for and why we're doing this, and confirming, you know, the 70% of folks that want a library do want a library at this cost. I mean, that's reasonable and transparent to the voters. And then you know, and then you can charge right ahead if it's a yes.
Well, the problem though is that we have the budget now, and we aren't going to have the study back before the end of our budget season, though. So
The budget's not set, though. I mean,
not
we're
yet,
talking about
but
that.
I don't think we're going to get the study completed that will give us the full impact of all the 3 building projects that we're looking at, though, that we want to review back in time for the end of our budget. So why can't we earmark, put in the $720,000, but that doesn't mean that we're moving forward with that project yet?
I think it's just a lot of money to have, though. Because if you put that, I'm going to agree with John, if you put that 720, people are going to think that we're passing the library and it's going to move forward faster. And then when you commit to that construction firm with that dollar amount, you're locked in. And like, we have to move fast, like we can't draw it out. So I think we need to do concepts and approve a scenario first before we approve this $720,000 in architectural fees.
I'm confused
Wait.
on where the $720,000 is in reference to the library. That's not where we're asking for in 2023.
That
No.
number was well, I'll let Greg.
It was probably the number that was given last month.
Yeah.
So we
So we-
had 7 initiatives listed in our memo from our last meeting for a total of $145,000, which still, some would argue, is a lot to say, hey, let's go forth. However, I think we'll get the information we need, and we'll actually be able to start offering more programs to people looking for library services in our community.
And that includes getting design concept and what we need moving forward for a referendum.
So then where's the 720?
That's an old number.
It's an old number,
It's an
and
old number.
It's in the packet,
I'll
number
say it's in the
4.
packet in all our scenarios.
Number 4, but it's, like you said, Cindy, it's spread over 3
Right.
years. From 2023 to 2026. So maybe a more reasonable number in there for 2023 would be the 288. Or is that still more than you think
Sounds
it
like it's more
would
than that,
cost?
or less than that.
I counted 145 in what we approved in our board
Okay.
meeting last week. Am I correct in that, fellow board members? So the document that's online that,
I mean, I think we need the design concept going forward next year.
Which costs?
And so,
35. Yeah, Stefan, you're right. I did have to jump on a plane, so I did get off before we voted, but I distinctly remember doing the math in the airport, that it was about 145.
yep.
right, and I mean, I think we can write an RFP that says exactly what we're looking for without committing to $720,000 next year.
No, would be the year after then, right? If everything moves forward and everything, would be the year after you start doing actual nuts and bolts.
Architectural
Yeah.
work, yes, which is much more expensive than concept.
Yeah.
And-
No, I knew that.
Just to be clear too, Stefan, right, like, I'm looking at the agenda from Wednesday. That was all in. That's not just a facility study or a space need. That's like everything. That's the full request for all of next year from the library board is 145K.
I think so.
Library impact, implementation of the library impact fee, or study around that, programming, so $20,000 to go towards some programming operational costs, hiring of the library director / consultant, space needs and design engineering for village library, operational funds, which is 5,000, strategic planning and community engagement, so that's 30,000, and then administrative support is the seventh thing, and that's the support we get from JJ already, which is great.
Thank you, JJ.
I mean, and I think we put our library goals on that as well, so you can see, what we're working on in 2023.
What was the operational for 2023? The total amount that we wouldn't be borrowing for?
Yeah, we didn't break it out into capital or.
No, I didn't.
It was just financial requests.
Okay, because that would impact 2023 levy, so that would either, eliminating a position or not hiring a planned position.
I think the only thing in this list that could be considered capital, and even then I would question it, would be the space needs and design engineering. And if we combine that with overall facilities needs, would that be capital or would that be operating?
I think the big thing.
I'm not an accountant, so I just play one on TV.
And I think that's why, with this meeting moving forward, getting some direction on where we need to go, because hiring something like a library director would have a pretty substantial impact on the 2023 general fund, especially when we're looking at where CPI is as opposed to our levy limit this year. And we're well over 7% from just a cost of living perspective increase. And as you guys see by the numbers, we just can't keep up. So that would likely not allow us to hire, another individual or potentially even cut somewhere.
That's a good point. This is a consultant position, so it's not a village staff position. Does that make a difference?
Unfortunately, you can't, or you have to borrow taxable bonds for that. And it depends on what the dollar amount you're talking about for the consultant. It's obviously a lot less than paying benefits.
Yep, it's 50,000. Top end of the range.
So that's 1 to 2 part-time people we're talking about. Just to impact on the general fund if we're keeping things consistent. And again, this is
I'm fuzzy. How is 50,000 1 to 2 full-time staff?
Sorry, part-time. So like you're thinking about like your parks people,
Okay.
or rec programs. That's the people that I think would be most impacted by this.
So Cameron, you didn't have these numbers in the operational?
No.
Data. Okay.
And I actually just as a note up there, I don't know I haven't looked at how we're coming to these numbers. I looked at the agenda and I saw kind of just some highlights, operational and construction separate, but I haven't looked at and validated anything that we were given yet, and that's something I can certainly work with JJ. Again, we were waiting kind of for some direction on where to go forward.
Yes, John, are you looking for I'm looking at the agenda, are you looking for a motion?
We'll have to have some direction for staff, so, probably the various pieces in, and then we'll have to do like we normally do, is look what needs to come out, because I'll guarantee you, even with all these, because the library is one piece, we have all the other departments will be asking. Okay, whatever that is. They'll be asking for other staff, so, police may ask for another officer. We already kind of know what the EMS number is, and it's 14% increase. So we'll have to put all that together, but it sounds like where the board's leaning is towards including the request for the library as well, and then we'll have to, again, see how everything stacks up, because as we do every year, we have to pull things out. And then we'll have to make those hard choices. And Matt, a lot of times, makes a lot of them for us before we even see it. So
At this point, I consider the library kind of another department, so I think putting in their figures for this year for us to review, for the budget review committee to look at, and then have all the numbers on a whole to then go in and parse out what needs to be to get to where we need to be, I think is my direction that I'm leaning towards at this point. Just so we can better understand the full scope. It sounds like Cameron hasn't had a chance to review this information either.
Well, and I'm sorry about that. I don't know if we've met, and I didn't know that I was supposed to do that. Yeah, I've been working on this for like months now. And
Yep, so last month they jumped in here, so no big deal. What would be important for me to know with these, are we talking about full-time equivalents, part-time equivalents, and really being able to dive into if we can get some comparables to communities that have built similar sized libraries. I know somebody said Monona was similar to what our objective was. I saw that they have 9 full-time equivalents.
it's in my spreadsheet.
Yeah, and we can certainly schedule.
Because it's a multi-level library, so their staffing needs are completely different than ours would be as a one-story library. So it's not that was not the best.
Yeah, and I did see when I was looking at their budget, I saw 9 full-time equivalents and I think 4 part-time. And I was coming close to 800,000 just for staffing. So I just need to kind of see how with the impacts of what our benefits would be, just to make sure we're coming in the same ballpark.
Maybe you and I should sit down.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Cindy
Cindy
knows a lot, so she can definitely go.
Can I also just provide feedback? So when someone does email the staff to say, hey, what are the processes and policies for hiring and planning for staff, and you don't get a response, or the response is, I don't have a template, I'm at a loss right now, because I asked the question over a month ago about this position.
So in April, we have been without a finance director, which also wears the HR cap, outside of making personnel, hire, fire decisions, which are primarily Matt. So I'm stepping into that role now, so if I didn't get that email, I apologize. But like I said, once we get some figures in and I sit down with Cindy, we can get you some better answers.
I wouldn't say better answers. We have the answers.
Okay.
We need to know who to give the information to. Just respectfully,
sure.
The better answers, we all need to stop saying that, because we all work really hard. I didn't know anything about this other stuff, but I'm a little offended on, hey, we haven't done our homework on this. Because we've been working really damn hard. You guys work really darn hard. So just some feedback on that sort of thing. I think our community deserves better.
Just a question. I'm not familiar with the email that was being referred to about hiring someone and needing to know a policy. I'm not sure what that's in reference to.
I sent JJ an email. JJ forwarded it to, asked me to send it to someone else. And I asked that question about template and what processes are out there, and I got really nothing back. And then to be told we're not doing our due diligence.
I don't think anybody said that you're not doing your due diligence. I don't believe that. He just said he's getting up to speed because he's only started a few weeks ago. So you have to give him a little bit of slack too, respectively. So
I agree. I'm sorry I wasn't giving that level of respect.
we have one of the leanest staff in the Dane County, and they work their tails off. So, all right, David, you want to take a shot at this? You seem to
I
think.
started typing and then Melissa.
Oh my gosh.
Kind of, I don't know. All right.
you.
I'm going to riff on this one. So I'd like to make a motion to direct staff to work with library scenario number 1 for the financial management plan, and work with Ellers to bring back recommendations for annual debt limits, as well as work a subgroup of trustees to work with village staff to develop a prioritization process.
I'm not sure I would want to stay just the library. I would say all of it. Just a comment on the motion. That's because it should be all of it. And then we prioritize.
Well, I was just looking at the agenda item to talk about, but I guess you're right. Lisa, I want to amend my.
Sorry, David. I
was vamping and I was like I should have just kept writing. Lisa, I'll amend my motion to include library scenario 1, and the subgroup should continue to work on the village, all other projects included in tonight's presentation.
I'll second, but I have a immediate question after that. So, are you saying that we should not even consider other library scenarios in this prioritization?
Because it almost sounds like we're voting on scenario 1.
Yeah.
Okay, since it's a subgroup, we can consider all. Lisa, I'm sorry.
I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. Would it be
Yeah.
easier just to look at 2023 and what needs to put us in position for all scenarios at a minimum?
Sure. I will amend my motion as stated.
Does that make sense to everybody?
So say it again.
Jesus. Okay, Lisa, what do you have so far?
Motion by David to direct staff to work, let me start over. To direct staff to work with library scenario number 1 for the FMP and work with Ellers to bring back a recommendation of an annual debt limits along with subgroup of trustees to have priority list. And then you amended it to include the library scenario 1 and work with all other projects included in the presentation.
The only thing I would change is that the subgroup should work on a prioritization process instead of a plan.
Can I interject?
Please.
For purposes of bringing some other scenario back, I think if you're trying to look at, the broader context here of facilities and your other capital investment, and you don't want to see your geo-debt utilization reach a certain amount. I get back to what we said earlier. I think to give you some guidance on how you prioritize, it'd be easier to come back with a general dollar amount that you have over a period of time, then you can apply. We're starting with a scenario that has a $12 million capital project. We're just going to start cutting everything else
Yes.
to get to a certain amount. And at the end of the day, I think you're still trying to make prioritization of multiple areas. So having some gross dollar amounts to work with might be a more efficient way to have that discussion.
That was my original intent, was to have you guys come back and tell us what the debt limits were. And then John had a good point that we shouldn't pigeonhole ourselves to a given scenario. So,
Probably better to know that first, so you can figure out what can be, and then prioritize and say, okay.
to direct staff to work with Ellers to bring back annual debt limits, recommendations, and have a subgroup work through all scenarios, as well as create a prioritization plan for the village board as a whole. Thank you, capital prioritization plan. When I don't write them down, it's just.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to put,
Think out loud.
I'll still second.
do you have any other caveats to that or no?
I guess my question is, does that capture what we talked about? And is this enough guidance to bring something forward at next meeting?
Yeah, absolutely, does this get you what you need for Monday?
Yeah, by focusing on broader dollar amounts of this is what you have to work with from a capital perspective, it's going to give you a range of time of how much you have to spend on various projects to do that prioritization. Because I think there's, I've heard what you've all said, there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of, projects that you may want to continue to vet, whether it's facilities or roads or parks or whatever. So by just focusing, taking a step back at a slightly higher level, it says this is the dollar amount you have to work with, then you can make that decision. And, as I said in the opening statement, how you spend the money isn't
You don't care how we spend it.
Yes, that's not our decision.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think when you know that you can't do everything you have on the list, start with a broader dollar amount to work with so you could then prioritize it, rather than just, picking out some larger ticket dollar items to back into a number, because I don't want that to be perceived as those are the projects you need to fund. I think there's enough challenging decisions to make that having a dollar amount to work with would help you prioritize a little bit better, in my opinion.
Can I just ask David that you recap that one more time for me, please?
Okay.
Did you write it down?
Go to the tape. No, I'm kidding.
God, where's the replay when I need it?
Yeah.
I made a motion to direct staff to work with Ellers to provide the village board with debt limit recommendation, annual debt limit recommendations, and for a subgroup of trustees to devise a prioritization process. Capital, thank you, keep forgetting it. Capital prioritization process. And apply that process to all projects discussed this evening. And report back to the village board.
By when?
Thank you.
Is there a second?
Actually, well,
I'll second.
discussion. John, how do we want to pick the subgroup? Would you pick that, or is it volunteers, or?
Well, that was actually my discussion points. I don't quite know why we need a subcommittee. So Jonathan you have some municipalities that have done a prioritization process. Could the direction be that we ask Ehlers to provide us with that process is, and we discuss it as a board and decide if we want to follow it?
Even better.
You don't have to
Yeah.
amend.
Even better. I like it. I like it. Thank you.
That's recorded, so we got it.
Thank you.
I don't want to
Sarah
put you
for
through
the
that
win.
again.
I'm just gonna
I put you on a
pass
spot,
out.
and then I made you do it 3 times. That's just vicious.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Good point. Any other discussion? All right, having heard none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? May abstain? Motion carries.
Hey, John, just one comment. It wasn't about this, that exact motion, so I didn't want to interject there. Melissa, just a clarification on the budget. So anything that's submitted to us gets put into the department or basically a proposed budget as submitted. So everyone always sees everything that's submitted, and then my cuts would just be up to the allowable levy that's in the financial management plan, so.
Yes, thank you.
And that Matt's making, for everybody in the room, Matt's making reference to next year's budget. So he's saying that everything in for next year will be put in there, and then the board considers all of those. So that's the normal process we do, but.
Correct. Yeah, I just
go
want to
ahead.
make it clear that I mean, I think maybe, John, you referenced that although I do make some tough cuts, so I mean, those are recommended cuts, but in addition, there's a transparency component that
Yes.
you still see everything that's proposed even before those cuts, because, you know, you guys very well may decide you didn't like one of my cuts and want to put something in that was proposed that I took out. So just want to be clear on that.
Yes, and that, again, that's the normal process. I think most everybody's been through it, maybe not Chris and Brittany yet, but it does work well, and the board can decide to put things back in or take more things out, and both have been done in my time. So I think that'll be the next step for at least 23, along with the capital effort and kind of looking at what we need, what we can allocate out, and then how that stacks up from a prioritization. Because we know we can't, as everybody saw from what Craig put together, and Jonathan, thank you both very much. I'm remiss not to say that, put together for the scenarios, but, you know, we're not going to be able to do that in the time frame. So how do we'll figure that out, how we kind of space it out. Some things will get smaller, some things, you know, will just get shifted out, some things may not happen. And that's just the way it is.
Can I just yes, I'd like to also echo John in thanking both of you for explaining everything so thoroughly that I think people that have been through this process before, I hope we're able to get up to speed on all the different factors. So I appreciate the thorough explanation.
And with that, I think I can thank the library board for coming, and as well as your input and everything and all your efforts and your passion about the library, as well as the budget review committee, some of which you guys have to stick around. So, but I think we're able to let them go then, because we have yet another closed session item we have to sort through yet tonight. So, I don't know, Larry, do we need to officially, do they need to officially adjourn? I suppose they do. Slamming the laptop is probably adjournment enough, I guess. Closing it nicely, they're too expensive.
I make a motion to close the library board.
Oh, yeah. Is there a second? That would be some.
Melissa made me do it.
And then finish it up. Finish it up, David.
All those in favor? Aye. Opposed?
How did you
We're all about process here.
I'm just doing, I'm like Ron Burgundy. You put it in front of me, I just read it.
Yeah. Thanks again, guys.
I just do what I'm told.
Okay, now you have to leave too, your library board.
So do I go out, turn around, and walk back in?
Just go right around. You get a stretch too.
That's right.
I love it. So, fire's canceled. Well, they're doing a grief session.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm not coming to your committee, so it's like, well, let's just cancel it. So.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
I believe I will be leaving and then he's going to close session, so then can you complete the minutes for me, just give me the motions?
As long as 4 of us show.
Yes.
Of what happened and what time you adjourned?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Well, two from the village, 2 from the town. Because
Right, we just never want to be promoted.
So Steve won't be.
Your cheat sheet.
Oh, yeah, I will give you a cheat
But there's
sheet.
nothing on the agenda.
All right, now I'm official. Whew, look out, it's got the scorecard. I'll screw that up too.
It still looks live to me.
We didn't go into closed session yet, did we? No.
So Greg and John, which one's Batman and which one's Robin? I love it. I love it. Have a good night, guys.
They may choose a different superhero duo, so maybe like Wonder Twin powers activate.
I love it. Either way.
And that's old.
The dynamic duo.
All right. We have everybody? Oh, we don't have.
Oh, here's the Melissa.
Yeah.
Did anybody ever see the Simpsons episode where he was like, "I'm so hungry I could eat Arby's"?
Recording stopped.
Anybody? Anybody? No? It was a Simpsons episode. They,
Oh, to
like,
make
they
the
made a
motion.
big joke about Arby's, and they're like, "I'm so hungry I could eat an Arby's," and Chris has a bag of Arby's there. They're sitting around a campfire and they haven't eaten for a day, and they're like, "I'm so hungry I could eat an Arby's."
There's some bad movies of people sitting around.
What's
Com- There's some pretty bad movies about people sitting around fires
Right,
too.
exactly. I never thought my kids would like The Simpsons. That's like the #1 cartoon. I was like, I would have never guessed. Out of any cartoon ever made, that's the one they can sit and watch that.
Surprise me at all.
Right? They can sit and watch it for days.
Larry.
They can only blame that on you. Your wife can only blame that on you, right?
Well, it's better than Family Guy.
JJ.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We didn't make the motion. Can we?
Oh, you didn't yet?
Not yet,
That's
we
all
gotta
right.
make the motion. to go
We
into
will,
closed
we
session.
will, but
A little dead,
it's not a worry.
What's that?
a little dead time right now, huh?
Okay. All right, I'll make a motion to go into closed session regarding employee discipline. The Village of Cottage Grove will enter a closed session pursuant to Wisconsin State Statute 19.85, parentheses G, conferring with legal counsel for the governmental body who is rendering oral or written advice concerning the strategy to be adopted by the body with respect to litigation in which or likely to become involved.
Second.
Thank you, David.
Ballwig.
Aye.
Murphy.
Aye.
Peterson.
Aye.
Radcliffe.
Aye.
Stoa.
Yes.
Valencia.
Aye.
And Williams.
Aye. We are in closed session.